Good morning. Good morning. Hope everybody is doing well today. I am working on a few different things. And haven't been in for a few days, so I wanted to make sure that I got in here and got into a live. Talked about some of our typical subjects. I hope everybody is having a grand time. We've had this conversation a little bit before, and some of it we've not really touched on a whole lot because we had other stuff that we were touching on. So I wanted to make sure that I came back in and we touched on some of it a little bit more. As usual, I am also over on YouTube. And as usual, you can find the sources for these things over on my nwitaor.com site. I'm working on my nails today, so if filing is hard for you, I apologize, but it keeps my sense focused and keeps me capable of doing things without getting distracted, and it's something I need to do. So I will be doing. We're just going to talk about a few different things. Hello, everybody. I am doing a lot better. I'm no longer sick. My cat is no longer sick. My dog's surgery has been taken care of. I appreciate everybody who helped with that and helped us get back on our feet a little bit. We have been doing a lot of stuff around here, trying to just trying to function. I'm doing really good. I'm definitely not sick with the COVID anymore. I seem to have like some allergies going on, but that's about it. So if I sneeze, that's why. Once it gets pretty high, I'll probably stop and we'll talk about, boundaries within this space, but we're just at 18 right now. So I'm not going to worry too much about talking so much about boundaries because most people who are in here know the boundaries within this space. I'm going to kind of leave it a little bit open to start off with. We have a lot of people in here who are in here frequently. And so I know that there's usually questions and different things that people want information on or things that they want to bring to light. So I'm going to kind of leave it open for questions for a little bit and kind of answer questions for a little bit. And then we'll go ahead and get started on some of the subjects as we go through. If you are new, I'm an archaeologist and an anthropologist and a historian. I look light, but I'm not white. I'm very globally mixed, and I am Indigenous by upbringing and connection. I choose to use TikTok as a space to teach and a space to give information. I would like to double down on the fact that I'm not an expert in any field. I don't want to be an expert in any field. That's not my goal in life. I am giving base information. I am not giving stuff that is going to give you a college degree. I'm not giving professor level information that you're going to get out of a college. A couple different reasons for that. One is that I personally believe that have a great night, Pink. The more you put into it, studying, the more you put into learning something, the more you know. So if you're just listening to some stranger tell you things, you're not gathering a lot of information. You're just gathering some surface level stuff. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is this isn't a college course, right? Like I don't have 6 weeks to teach you a specific subject, right? So base level information is pretty much it. So please understand that I'm not trying to at any level state that I am an expert on anything. I do have focuses in my specific areas of study. You're correct. Humanity is nonviolent, but it can be, right? And we are currently living in a societal structure that teaches us and indoctrinates us into violence. And we are currently at constant war with each other. This really is only about 10,000 years old for our species, though. This isn't something that we've done throughout the prehistory of our species. This is something that's relatively new. And that's kind of what we're focused on is how it's relatively new and how the fact that it being relatively new is affecting us. And humans are nonviolent by nature. There is no evidence throughout the course of prehistory that shows that humans are violent by nature. There's no Evidence of definitive violence prior to 10,000 years ago. I'm just starting. It's okay. I haven't even really started touching on the subject. I'm absolutely just going off of or just answering things currently. My evidence is in my website, nwitaor.com, and it has links to articles that talk about the rise of violence and the lack of violence prior to 10,000 years ago. It also talks about why violence rises and what the associated things going on at that timeline are. Western agriculture, stratified societies are a couple of things that are really within that, right? And so I have cited my evidence. It is on my website. Uh, you're welcome to go there and look at it, right? Awesome, awesome, awesome. I like being background noise. I think it really is the best way to be. So if we get really weird in here, I will turn off the comments as per usual, but you can go to my YouTube, and there's scientific research that argues what I'm stating. The evidence that I have is scientific evidence in the field that I belong to, which is the field that specifically studies the evolution of humanity and what we've been doing throughout the history and prehistory of humanity. You can be sorry all you want, but you're incorrect. I'm not in denial. You are. Let me go ahead and put a sticker in the background that gives you the YouTube so people can get to it. Hey, hey, hello, everybody. I'm just giving me a sticker here really quick so that you guys can get to the YouTube channel if you want to go over there, if the comments go off. And again, my website has the citations that you might need or the sources that you might need for some of this evidence and for some of this conversation, right? And the website is nwitaor.com. So basically the same as the YouTube with the .com behind it. So as we're talking today, I am kind of going to leave a lot of it open for question and answer, though I will, if it gets bad, like I said, I will go ahead and turn the comments off. We've all been in here when it has been pretty bad and we've needed to turn the comments off pretty much. So if that happens, again, you can go over to YouTube and you can comment there. So when I'm talking about the things that we're talking about today, all of this stuff is stuff that there is scientific evidence behind. All of this stuff comes from articles in accredited journals. All of this stuff comes from research done by paleoanthropologists, anthropologists, and scientists. And so what we're talking about is the biological drives of humanity versus the indoctrination of humanity, right? Versus the creation of this indoctrination within us that tells us that this is who we are, as opposed to understanding who we are on a biological level and what biological drivers we have, right? The things that we have that are actually innate to us. Now, we've been taught as a society, as a global society, that we're really innately violent and we're innately othering and that we innately hate others. We've been taught all of this stuff as an indoctrination, because as long as they can indoctrinate you into believing that you're these things, then they can maintain control over you. Most of this comes about underneath the need for certain people to maintain control in a stratified society. Stratified societies are an extremely recent development. Stratified society is only about 10,000 years old, and stratified society comes alongside the rise of violence, alongside the rise of Western agriculture, and alongside the deification of narcissism and the manufacture of evil. And when we look at those things and when we look at how these things are coming about and how they affect us, we can see how these effects and how these things coming about have been created for us instead of our things that we are innately and our things that we are naturally. If you've been in my conversations before, we've talked about, or in my lives before, we've talked before about Homo erectus. Homo heidelbergensis, and some of the other human species. Homo means human. That's the Latin meaning of the word homo, which is why homo. We use the word homo for the genus having to do with us and other human species. Um, when we're looking at other human species and we're looking about us and we're looking about our rise as a species and how we come about, we see that there isn't a lot of othering in that coming about. Um, can I link the manufacture of evil to the destruction of divine feminine in society? Uh, kind of. So I can link the manufacture of evil to the rise of othering. And I can link where the destruction of femininity as a divine thing, or the divine feminine and the divine masculine, sacred masculinity, sacred femininity, the destruction of those things come about with the rise of stratification and the rise of othering, right? So I can link how they come about within that structure to that structure, and I can link how the narcissism and the deification of narcissism links with those things, as well as that rise of evil within it. Um, the the destruction of the divine feminism, though, is one of the levels of othering, right? So othering is, and this is othering is a means of control, right? Othering starts when we see the start of stratified society and the rise of Western agriculture. And it starts with the barbarians of the hills are going to steal your food, right? Um, and this is why you have to pay me so that I can provide this army to protect you. And then it goes to nationalism, and then it goes to gender, and we see the rise of othering based in gender really among the ancient Greeks that then devolves down to the Romans, and then devolves down further from that. And that use of gender to other is that destruction of the divine feminine, that destruction of the idea that feminine and masculine both have divinity to them and both have sacredness to them, right? And that idea that men are stronger than women and men should maintain control over women. So it does link with othering, um, which definitely links with that manufacture of evil. So I don't want people to think that I'm stating that there's not evil in our society. Humanity has plenty of evil in our society today. The thing is that evil that we have in our society is a evil that has been manufactured through indoctrination and through the way that we raise our children. So I think I was probably like 20 when I realized that the reason that we have so much sexual perversion within our society is because we've made sex a sin. When we started making sex taboo, when we started making what is, whether you believe in God or whether you're an animist or whether you're a pagan, what is truly a gift to humanity, that ability to have pleasure in our procreation. When you link that with a taboo, when you make that a taboo or you make that a sin, then people's sexual urges relate to taboo in their mind. And that relation of taboo to sexual urges in somebody's mind, especially if you double down with parenting that is toxic towards it. Like you have those people who are abusing their children for their natural sexual urges, right? When you see that, it creates this toxicity around sex within society. It creates rapists. It creates pedophilia. It creates these issues within our society, and it creates these issues when are in our society manufactured. It manufactures them, right? So this is where we talk about the manufacture of evil, right? Now that doesn't mean that we don't have evil. Somebody who is out assaulting women or children is absolutely evil, or assaulting other humans would be the best way, because people assault men too. Somebody who is out assaulting others, especially things like sexual assault and things like that, absolutely evil. That is absolutely evil behavior, right? And yeah, it is something that has been created within them. It is not a natural thing that is, it's nature versus nurture, right? It's the nurture part of it. It's not the nature part, because the nature part of it is that finding pleasure in something like that is a positive, right? Absolutely. And so, yes, you can relate it. Um, or it is all related and it is all intertwined. It just has like some steps. Like I can't go, absolutely directly this and that, right? Um, yeah, and it is. It is definitely nurture versus nature, right? We see that narcissism is a lot of nurture versus nature too, right? And we see that, well, there is um, a mutation that can happen within humans that creates narcissistic personality disorder, right? That you still have to have that nurture that creates the narcissistic personality disorder as well for somebody to be MPD. You don't just have the gene that they associate with psychopathy and MPD, and then have a perfect life and have MPD. You have the gene that's associated with MPD and a traumatic childhood, right? And so, first thing I want to go over is what our biological drivers are, right? Hello, hello. First thing I want to go over is what our biological drivers are. And to do this, I'm going to take us back to really the start of who we are. As I said, paleoanthropology is one of those things that I'm really into. It's one of my main focuses within my career, and it is one of the main things that I've been studying for a long time. And when we look at early humans and we early Homo sapiens, us, we see that first of all, we are created from convergence. Our species itself is created from convergence. We are one of the few species out there that is created from convergence. Convergence is many different species coming together to create, right? Hello. And when we look at the way we see Homo sapien created, we see that Homo sapien starts in Morocco as our oldest find about 300,000 years ago. At this time, we see that Homo sapien comes about because you have several different bands of humans living together. So you have Homo heidelbergensis and Homo antecessor and Homo ergaster and Homo erectus and all these other species of Homo all living in the same communities. I always like to point out the difference between the phrase tribe and band. The word tribe itself means a community based on genetic lineage, and the word band means a community based on need instead of genetic lineage. So, a tribe might have a matriarch who had 10 daughters, and each of her 10 daughters end up being a clan or a household, and they pass on, and your citizenship within that tribe is based on whether or not you were born into one of those family lines, whereas a band is based on whether or not you need more people in your community, right? Whether or not these people provide something. And at this point of time, the provision is bodies, right? At this point of time, the provision that we're looking at is bodies because of the fact that when we're looking at 300,000 years ago, having 30 to 40 people in your group means higher survivability for your group and your community. So when we look at the start of Homo sapien, we see that the start of Homo sapien comes about from a convergence of several different species who are living together within a band, right? Hierarchical societies are recent. Hierarchical societies are only about 10,000 years old. Then the rise of stratification and hierarchy is alongside the rise of violence. It creates the rise of violence and the rise of manufactured evil and the rise of the deification of narcissism. Hierarchy is not who we are. We're not very hierarchical. We are, in fact, very equitable usually. So, when we're looking at the start of our species, we see that the start of our species comes about through this convergence of many different species living together. So when we see the start of our species, we don't see a species that is looking at somebody who looks different and going, "Oh, you're different." This currently is our start as a species. So this is pre us being global. It's when we're only in one spot is what we're currently talking about, right? Um, it's considered Middle Stone Age, Cardos. So when we see the rise of that start of us within bands of many different people that look different, we see us starting at a space and a time. If your grandmother looks like a Homo heidelbergensis and your grandfather looks like a Homo erectus and your mother looks like a Homo antecessor, you're not looking at all of these different species of humans and seeing something different. You're looking at different species of humans and seeing family, just like you do today. Just like, say, your mother comes from the Khoi people of South Africa, and so she's extremely dark skinned. And maybe your father comes from Sweden, and so he's extremely light skinned. You still don't see them as being different from you. You see them as being mom and dad, right? So the same thing is happening in the rise of species, or the rise of our species from among many other species. So the idea that we're looking at other species and going, oh my God, you look different, I'm going to kill you, is really far out there. The other thing that we need to look at is our biology. And biologically, we have a couple of things that are really important when we look at what is innate to us as a species. The first thing that we have is something that the only other species on this planet that's ever had is Neanderthal. And this is what we call mandatory midwife assisted childbirth. What this is the fact that when we give birth to a child, if you take a look at a great ape is going to give birth to a child that has an extremely small body compared to the pelvic outlet of the mother ape. And that child is going to come out facing nose up. And so when that child comes out, it's coming through a big hole. It's a small baby. It passes easily. The great ape reaches down, grabs her infant, pulls it to her chest. Okay. When you look at us and Neanderthals, you see that we have these large heads and these kind of broad shoulders, and our pelvic outlet is so much smaller than the head and the shoulders. So we can't pass through this big circular pelvic outlet as a small baby because we're not a small baby and it's not a big circular pelvic outlet. The pelvic outlet for us and Neanderthals is oval. And our heads are oval and our shoulders are oval, but in a T, right? So our heads go back to front oval and our shoulders go side to side oval. So when you look at us and Neanderthals and the way that we birth babies, which you're looking at is a child, an infant that starts with its nose facing backwards. As it comes to that first point of the pelvic outlet where you have to have the head go through the pelvic outlet, you have to turn that infant about a quarter of a turn. So that their backward facing head that goes like this can fit through the pelvic outlet that goes like this, right? So now I've got your head through the pelvic outlet, but your shoulders are going the other way. So I need to turn you another quarter of a turn so that you can get through the pelvic outlet. This is mandatory midwife assisted childbirth. And when we look at the fact that we have mandatory midwife assisted childbirth, this means that we have to have somebody help us giving birth. This means that we need community. Somebody else has to be there to help us give birth. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule. We've all heard of random exceptions. People, when I was young, they talked about how women could give birth in rice paddies, right? And now Asian women would give birth in rice paddies. I remember the story from when I was young. We're looking half the time at children who are much smaller. And just because you're outside giving birth, if you have a community of women around you, you're not giving birth on your own. You have help, you have assistance in that birth, right? So when we're looking at this, yeah, and just because you can doesn't mean it's ideal, right? So when we're looking at this, yes, of course, there's exceptions to every rule, but that does not mean that the exceptions are the rule, right? It means that they are the exceptions. So the rule is that we have mandatory midwife assist childbirth, which means that we must have community to give birth to our children, right? The other thing that we have that no other species, not even Neanderthal, has is the fact that we have 5 life stages from neonate to adult. Neonate is newborn, and adult is when your brain has fully formed. So for us currently, neonate to adult takes 25 years. Our brain fully, our brain, our brain fully closes at 25 years of age, right? So when we're looking at us currently, it's 25 years from neonate to adult. 100,000 years ago, it might have been 15 years from neonate to adult, right? It might have been 20 years from neonate to adult. They don't count anything from adult beyond as a stage. They don't count adult as a life stage. It's from neonate to adult is 5 life stages. So technically, I think we have like 7 life stages because we have adult and then we have elder, right? What they're talking about is brain development when they're talking about the 5 life stages from neonate to adult, okay? And they're talking about the way that our brains develop. So the way that our brains develop during this time period, if you think of an infant, right? It takes an infant a couple of years to get from birth to the point that they can walk, maybe feed themselves, and don't need assistance as much, right? Maybe they're potty trained, they can, put food in their own mouth. So this is a period of time in which their brain is developing to process all of these things so that they can learn all these things, right? And because it's such an extended period of time, it allows for more malleability of their brain. And that greater malleability of the brain is what they think gives us, or is in part what gives us our greater intelligence that they think we have, right? So when we look at other species on this planet, all other species on this planet, their life stages are much less, right? So um, the other highest from neonate to adult, I believe, is elephants, and this is 5 years. So if they have 5 years from neonate to adult, and we have 25 years from neonate to adult, it's like 5 times that amount. Now, during this time from neonate to adult, we have to have help. Like our neonates, our newborns, unlike a snake who comes fresh out of the egg and travels along and doesn't even need a parent, we have to have somebody teach us how to eat and somebody to change our diaper and somebody to protect us from the predators and somebody to teach us how to walk, right? So that requires nurture. Now, when we look at having to nurture something from neonate to adult, and we look at someone who has an extended period of time of nurture before they're capable of protecting themselves, feeding themselves, providing care for themselves, what we're looking at is the need for community. And as we were just talking about, when you're looking at these early communities, the more the better. The more bodies that you have in an early community, the better. And the reason being for that is if we're going to go out hunting, one of us going out hunting is not likely to catch big game. And one of us going out hunting is very likely to be assaulted by a predator and die. 10 of us going out hunting is more likely to catch big game and less likely to be assaulted by a predator and die. Hi, Sleepy. So when we're looking at these communities, we know we need minimum of like 5 to 10 people to go hunting big game. Now we now know that we have as many women hunting as we do men, that there is not a gender binary prior, and that there is no gender binary in hunter gatherers that states this is a woman's chore, this is a man's chore, especially when it comes to things like hunting. We now know that we are able to get all of the nutrients that we need. We are omnivoric species, which means we need both meat and plant matter. And because we need both meat and plant matter, we can actually get those things just from hunting animals. If you look at communities in the Arctic, you'll see that communities in the Arctic where there's not a lot of vegetation growing will get their vegetative needs from the stomach contents of the herbivores that they kill. So if I kill a sea cow, the stomach contents or what we call the rudiment will provide all the nutrients that I need of the vegetative nutrients that I need, right? So we now know that early groups, the women are hunting as much as the men. When we're looking at things that are being gathered, we need to think of things like going down the river to get water, right? How are you hauling water from far away, right? When we're looking at things like gathering rocks to make your stone tools or gathering reeds to make basketry, right? All of these things are things that are going to be performed by both biological, well, all three biological sexes, because we actually have three biological sexes, right? And there are definitely things that need more than one person to do. If you're going down to the water and there are predators in the water, you need 2 or 3 of you at least, minimum, so that somebody can watch for the predator while you're pulling water from the river, right? So somebody's watching behind you, somebody's watching in front of you, and you're gathering the water from the river. Somebody's making sure that a crocodile or a hippo isn't coming up and snacking on you, and somebody's making sure that a lion isn't coming up and snacking on you, and you're gathering the water out of the river. So you need minimum 3 people, right? More like 5 to 10 people just to go and get water. You need at least 10 people to go hunting for the same reasons, right? So when we're looking at these things, we see that an early community requires several members. It is not something that you can do on one person alone, right? Timeline pre-agriculture. So I'm going to go with the idea that you're talking about Western-based agriculture, okay? Because agriculture is tending, right? And we've been tending since we were born, since we came about, right? But Western-based agriculture is in monocrop agriculture. Monocrop agriculture, the very first monocrop agricultures that we see start along the Nile River roughly 15 to 18,000 years ago. The first outside in the Fertile Crescent starts roughly 14,000 years ago. And then we start building monocrop agriculture based cities roughly 9,000 years ago. And this is where you start to see that stratification of society start and that rise of violence start. But back to early. Um, and that's like we've been around by 290,000 years by that point. So when you're looking at early groups of humans, you're looking at a group that needs roughly 30 members minimum, right? So when you have an infant in that space, it's taking all members of community to provide the nurture to get that child from neonate to adult, right? You need somebody who is going to be able to tend the child. Most likely they're going to um there's a couple of different things. So monocrop or Western-based agriculture is the removal of everything from a space and the planting of something. Prior to that, and in other spaces in the world where that didn't take effect until later, tending is the best term for it. Honorable harvest is a term that's used frequently, and what it is it is so everything has a prune need, right? Like we usually hear about pruning your roses or pruning your flowers, or everything needs to be pruned, kind of cut back so that it can grow better, right? And when you look at tending agriculture basically prunes, right? I might come and pick a couple of pieces of I might come and grab a couple of reeds for a basket. Maybe I need two from this plant and two from that plant and two from that plant. So I'm not taking all of the plant, I'm leaving the majority of the plant, and I'm basically pruning the plant so it can grow back better and I'm getting what I need from it. This can be called many different things. I tend to refer to it as tending because the things that I would otherwise refer to it are all indigenous based. And it is something all Turtle Island indigenous based, and it is something that is global. And so I don't want to use Turtle Island indigenous specific terms for it. But tending is basically you leave things where they're at and you just kind of help them to grow within that space. You don't take more than you need. You make sure everybody gets what they need out of it. You take only what you need. And by doing it in a season equivalent base, like you know that the time that a rose needs to be pruned is in the fall. So you might go and you might, get the so maybe you use rose wands, and so you're going to grab a couple of branches of rose from a rose bush, and that itself is going to prune that bush so that it can grow back better next year. But you're getting what you need out of it while you're tending it, right? And so that's basically tending, right? Turtle Island is one of about 5 or 6 different names for North America. And if you look at North America on the globe, it looks like a turtle. Um, it is translated into English. And there are 5 or 6 different phrases. Turtle Island has kind of become something that's been used by many nations who didn't originally use the phrase Turtle Island. But it is one of the terms for North America. It's the term that I choose to use for North America because it's the easiest for me. South America, one of 5 or 6 indigenous phrases is Abayala, and I use Abayala for South America. Absolutely. Have a great one. Um, the people that were along the Nile. We've been along the Nile since Homo habilis at 3 million years ago. Like we've always lived along the Nile. It's one of those very fertile spaces. Um, they may or may not be related to the descendant people that are currently there today. There are, that region being the breadbasket has been conquered, and many of the original peoples in that space have been annihilated over the course of history and prehistory, right? So the tending practices actually originate globally. This is animism. This is the belief that we are just a part of the world around us and we get our food from the world around us as we need it instead of taking more than we need to. And that the entirety of the biome is healthier than trying to rip everything out of a biome and, putting something that doesn't belong in that biome. I am. It is. I am. I'm trying to. I'm going with fall covers. I'm doing mushrooms on my nails. And so some of them didn't color out right because of the way I wanted to do it. So I'm kind of redoing some of them. Um, and this gives me the ability to do something while I'm doing it. And it also gives me like, I'm ADD. And so it's hard for me to focus sometimes, especially when there's a lot of comments, if you haven't noticed. And so this gives me an ability to kind of tie down my focus a little bit and make it easier for me. If it is bothersome, I do apologize. I know that for some people it can feel really weird, and I do apologize for that. I just it's helpful for me, and so we're going to do it. But I do apologize if it is bothersome. Um, so when we're looking at us as a species, we see that we must have. I carry several. We must have both nurture, right, to raise a child from neonate to adult. And it takes the nurture of an entire community to raise a child from neonate to adult. And we also must have community because it takes a community to nurture. Both males and females and intersex, or all males and females and intersex, need to provide that nurture. And the idea that that nurture from males is only protection, and that nurture from females is only nursing is new, right? That's a very new concept within us. Women have been hunters and warriors as long as we've been alive. Um, the idea that we're not is very, very new and really goes back to that, what we were just talking about when we were talking about that, the destruction of the divine feminine, right? That destruction of the way that we work. So, yes, my understanding is that there is a huge sharing between modern Egyptians and Egyptians 4,000 years ago. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the same as the Egyptians 8,000 years ago or people along the Nile 8,000 years ago, right? Um, or 18,000 years ago, right? So, yes, currently, when you relate the mummies, my understanding is there absolutely is a lot of genetic connection between the mummies and the Egyptians that are currently there today. It should be understood, though, that through the course of Egypt, or Kemet is actually the term for ancient Egypt, uh, through the course of Kemet's history, Kemet was conquered by the Greeks, conquered by the Scythians, conquered by uh, uh, my mind wants to say Polynesian, Phoenicians, conquered by the Phoenicians. So the rulers of Egypt, and therefore some of the mummies in Egypt, oftentimes came from outside Kemet because of the fact that these are conquering groups who are colonizing Kemet. Kemet, because of the fertility of the Nile. Again, we've been on the Nile since Homo habilis, like so before the start of our human, we've been on the Nile. That space along the Nile has always been extremely fertile because every time you see the flooding happen, the flooding replaces the fertility along the Nile, which is why monocrop agriculture actually works along the Nile but doesn't work anywhere else because of that yearly flooding before, of course, the dams that are currently in place, because the dams that are currently in place have blocked that yearly flooding and made it uh, so there isn't that replacement. That's also actually a problem that's currently happening in Egypt, right? Um, it was actually not people from Egypt or Kemet who ate mummies. It was absolutely the 19, 17 and 1800s English who did that, right? Uh, Wrecker, please stop with the caps just because you've been asked and because we do ask within here, right? The Mississippi does flood, and that would mean in the delta of the Mississippi that you would get that replenishment, but not along the regular branches of the Mississippi or the regular part of the Mississippi. So, as we're looking at who we are biologically, and you're fine, who we are biologically and what our biological drivers are, we see that our biological drivers are to nurture and our biological drivers are community. These are things that are very innate to us. When we look at these other things that we like to think of today that are innate to us, we're all born evil, we're all born in sin, things like that. What we're looking at is again this indoctrination, and I'd like to point out that no species develops things that are, no species speciates with things that are toxic to them. We might have mutations within a species that develop that are toxic to the species, but species don't develop with toxic traits. They develop with traits that are helpful to the continuation of the species. So when we look at things that are toxic to the species, we see that the things that we look at today that we're like, oh, this is innate to us, we're innately evil. We can't be innately evil and develop as a species. If we were innately out to kill each other when there was only 1,000 of us, then we would have gotten to the point that there's 8 million of us, right? So we have to look at the biological drivers of us prior to recorded history and prior to our understanding. I only stream on TikTok and YouTube for those in YouTube who are asking. Um, so these are things that are biological drivers for us. We are innately nurturing, we are innately communal, and we innately are creative too. Now, if you look at us as a species, we adapt our adaptations. A lot of other species on this planet will adapt their surroundings or make tools, right? And I do have a Patreon actually. Um, that we a lot of other species will make tools and a lot of other species will adapt their surroundings. We see that the fox can create a den, corvids can make tools, monkeys can learn how to do CPR. Like, I've seen picture or videos of monkeys in like Egypt, or not Egypt, I'm stuck on that now, India, in India, who are have learned to perform CPR, right? By watching humans perform CPR. So other species will adapt, and other species have tools, right? And they will adapt their surroundings. And all species adapt to their surroundings physiologically. It is that need to adapt to our surroundings physiologically that creates species themselves, right? Because adaptation to the surrounding is what creates speciation, right? Um, when we are looking at the need to adapt our adaptations, we see that sapien currently is the only species that does that. We see that Homo erectus does this. We see that Heidelbergensis does this. I don't know if you saw it come through the news, and we've talked about it in here a little bit. They recently found a 500-year or 500,000-year-old structure that was Homo heidelbergensis using wood to build actual, like, they think it's a walkway, but they're Lincoln logging shit. Like, they have logs with notches in them so that they can stack them like this. And this is 500,000 years ago in a species that we descended from, but is not our species. So we've been adapting our adaptations for as long as we've been around and longer, as long as human has been around. It is part of being human is to adapt our adaptations, right? So when we are looking at what makes us human and things that are very innate to our species, we see that the things that are innate to our species are being nurturing, having community, and adapting our adaptations, creativity, right? Science. Science is I observe something in nature, I have a hypothesis of what that might mean, I predict what that hypothesis might mean, and then I test my prediction. We get to theory when the tests for the predictions prove to be true. That becomes a theory. And if the tests for the predictions prove false, then we go back to the hypothesis and the prediction and restart it, right? All of this is how we get fire. All of this is how we get clothing. All of this is how we get 500-year-old buildings, right? Or 500,000-year-old buildings, right? All of this is adapting our adaptations. So these are biological drivers within us. These are the things that create our species. Now, when we're looking at this creation of our species within these things, when we're looking at the differences between us and other species, we see that these are definitely needed. When we look at how species are created, we see that species are created to fulfill a niche in the biome, right? The earth itself has this entire biome that it's creating, right? The trees, the plants around you, the other animals around you, this is a part of the biome. And each of these things fulfills a niche in the biome. Trees help create oxygen, plants feed other animals feed us. We tend the environment, and by tending the environment, we fulfill our niche within the environment. We fulfill our niche within the biome. So as we speciate within a biome, we speciate to fulfill a niche. When we're looking at this speciation to fulfill a niche within the biome, we see that that speciation is not going to develop things that are toxic to us or to the biome, right? If you are being created by a biome to fulfill a niche within the biome doesn't create you to be toxic to the biome, and it doesn't create you to be toxic from the biome, right? Which is why we start as Homo sapiens in Africa as dark skinned beings with tightly coiled hair and dark eyes. All of these things are explained by biology. If you are in a high sun content area, that dark skin, which is just a heavier concentration of melanin, we all have melanin, a heavier concentration of melanin protects your skin, protects you from the UV rays, and protects you from overdosing on vitamin D. The dark eyes are because if you have light eyes and you go into a high sun content environment, it'll give you headaches. You have to squint. You can't see very well. Light eyes are a low light adaptation. And the tightly coiled hair comes from the shading that it provides. So, tightly coiled hair, and this was a study done within the last year by an anthropologist who used to be a hairdresser who was a Black woman. And so she did a study trying to figure out, where does this come from? And what they figured out, or what she figured out, is that the tightly coiled hair creates a shade, right? It creates almost like a hat shade. And then the lattice work that it creates allows airflow, which cools the scalp, which cools the brain, right? So as Homo sapien is created in Africa, like Homo erectus is created in Africa before us, we see that Homo sapien is created with these things because these things fit the biome in which they are created. And we need to fit the biome in which we are created. Now, as we move across the globe, we adapt because adaptation is the beautiful thing about our species. Adaptation is the beautiful thing about every species, right? And one of the magnificent things about our species is that we can adapt. One of those adaptations is skin color. One of those adaptations is eye color. Those adaptations are advancements, though. They're not an evolutionary step forward. In some cases, they're actually an evolutionary step backwards, because if you look at light skin, I can take my light skin into places that don't have a heavy sun content and I'm okay. But if I try to take this light skin into a place that has a heavy sun content and I don't have protection, this is going to cause problems, right? Whereas if I have dark skin and I go into a low light environment, that's not going to cause problems. I can get vitamin D from other things. I can get vitamin D from plants, right? You can get vitamin D from killing animals and eating the rudiment of the stomach. So we see that there is this absolute adaptation of our species in the different environments that we go into. And this, the adaptation itself, is the magnificent thing about our species. All species are able to adapt. Not all species can adapt their adaptations, i.e., build a house, right? Not all species can do that, and we can do that. So, this shows us that we are nurturing and we are communal and we are adaptable and we are created by the biome, right? We are created by the environment around us to fulfill a niche within that biome. When we're looking at this and we're looking at who we are prior to 10,000 years ago, we're looking at a group who is moving across the planet into spaces that many times actually has other species of humans in it, right? Whether it's Neanderthal or Denisovan or ghost species that we don't know of, but we have them within our DNA, or other species that we see within the biome or within the archaeological record, but we don't see them within our DNA. So, as we're moving around the planet and we're coming in contact with these other species, most of these other species are descendant from the same grandparents we are. And so we're not seeing something that looks, I mean, they look different than us, but we're not seeing that difference as a bad thing. We, as our start of a species, aren't othering. We're not looking at other human species and going, oh my God, you look different. Your nose is so big. I just don't want anything to do with you. In fact, all evidence points that when we see something that doesn't look like us, we go, oh, you look new. Can we fuck? I mean, that's just really what we do. Like, all evidence points to the fact that every time we come in contact with something or another species that looks different than us, we have sex with it. We don't kill it. There's a lot of people who will tell you we killed off the Neanderthals. There's no evidence whatsoever that we killed off the Neanderthals. The evidence, in fact, shows that we actually mixed with the Neanderthals, the Neanderthals, by the time we come in contact with them, are so small as a species that they are actually inbred. Like they're having cousin relationships and aunt and uncle relationships, because by the time we come in contact with them, there's only about 10,000 of them left. They had gone through two near extinction events. There's 600,000 years as a species. And so by the time they come in contact with us, they're like, oh, I need some of the genes that you have because I don't have enough genes, right? When you start becoming inbred, you start mutating, right? Your body starts tossing mutations out. That's what inbreeding does. It starts tossing out mutations and it doubles down on those mutations. Habsburg jaw, right? Insanity, different things like that, right? So when we see that the Neanderthals coming in contact with Homo sapiens are like, hey, yay, good, I need some new genetics. And Homo sapiens coming across Neanderthals are like, oh, you look new. I like new. What you up to tonight? Hey, let's go sit by the fire and talk. And so when we're coming across new species, we're not seeing this level of othering that we have now. Um, as we're moving across the planet, we move into several different spaces across the planet. Our current knowledge is that the indigenous Australians are in Australia at 70,000 years ago. Indigenous Abayalians and Turtle Islanders are here at 50,000 years ago. That's our current knowledge. Our current knowledge is also that these two different groups of indigenous peoples actually met with species that were already here. So just like we meet with Neanderthal and Denisovan, there are actually species here in United States, not United States, in Turtle Island and Abayala, and there are species in Australia. We have a ghost species within Indigenous Australians, and we have a ghost species within Indigenous Turtle Islanders and Abayalians. We have evidence here in Turtle Island that goes back 250,000 years of human occupation. So that's in Abayala. 250,000 years in Abayala, 200,000 years here in Mexico, so in Turtle Island, right? So we have evidence that goes back 200,000 years and greater here. And that evidence that goes back that long is not a species of Homo sapien, because if you remember, we started 300,000 years ago. We're not over here by then. It is the ghost species that we see within Indigenous Turtle Islanders and Indigenous Abayalians, though. And this is part of what makes Indigenous Australians and Indigenous Turtle Islanders and Abayalians indigenous to this area, because in part they speciate in this area, just like Neanderthals speciate in Europe. And therefore, Europeans who are in Europe are actually descendants of the original species that speciates in that space, just like Tibetans are descendants of the Denisovans, and they get genes from the Denisovans that help them in that high altitude area. So we see that this happens for people as they're moving across the globe. So at this point of time, we're not seeing our species actually fighting anybody else, right? We have roughly 2,000 individuals, so skeletons, or sometimes it's just a little piece of a skeleton. Sometimes it's, an almost complete skeleton. It's very rare there's a full skeleton. But of the 2,000 individuals that we have prior to 10,000 years ago, roughly 2% of them have things that might be attributable to violence, not definitive violence, but might be attributable to violence. Let me explain what that means. If I find somebody whose skull looks like a rock hit them, I can't tell whether or not that rock was being held by another human being when that rock hit them, or whether or not they were in a cave fall and a rock fell, right? So the out of Africa theory states that we all leave Africa. Anybody outside of Africa left over 150,000 years ago and then advanced outside of Africa. It states that we were isolated, and it states that it's over 150,000 years ago, and it states that those outside of Africa evolved further than those inside of Africa. This is what has been debunked about the out of Africa theory. That is incorrect. We don't actually get. So at 50,000 years ago, the Levant area and the Arabian Peninsula are actually part of mainland Africa because of water levels. And so we go into the Levant area and mainland are into the Arabian Peninsula area roughly 150,000 years ago. We mix with the Neanderthals in that area. We don't solidify as a species, current understanding is, until about 125 to 130,000 years ago. And we don't leave the Levant area or the Arabian Peninsula until roughly 50,000 years ago, with the exception of Indigenous Australians. And we are seeing that the date for Turtle Islanders and Abayalians has been pushed back a little bit, because we now believe that they've been here for 50,000 years, and it took about 10,000 years in Southeast Eurasia for them to get Denisovan DNA within them, because they have Denisovan DNA. And so we think that they are leaving about 10,000 years, so about 60,000 years ago from that area, and then moving across and getting to this space about 50,000 years ago. So the out of Africa theory, as in everybody outside of Africa left Africa 150,000 years ago and evolved further, is absolutely incorrect. The idea that sapiens as a species speciate in Africa is absolutely true. And yet the idea that there are other human species that speciate across the globe outside of Africa is also absolutely true. And everybody on the planet has DNA from some of these other species. There are two places in Africa that don't have Neanderthal DNA, or two communities, and that those two communities are the Yoruba population of West Africa, geographically challenged, and the Kwe population is South Africa. Those two populations have three ghost species within them. So they did come in contact with another human species outside of Homo sapien, and they have DNA from other human species outside of Homo sapien, like everybody else on the planet. The rest of Africa and the vast majority of Eurasia has Neanderthal and sapiens. They're sapien with Neanderthal DNA. And then in Southeast Eurasia, the islands of the South Pacific, Australia, and Yaba Yala and Turtle Island, we see Denisovan DNA. And then in the islands, or in the indigenous Australians, we see a ghost species, and in Abialians and Turtle Island indigenous people, we see a ghost species. That is multi-regional speciation, yet Homo sapien itself is a species that we all currently belong to with admixture, because we like our admixture, we like, and that singular species with all that different admixture comes as we're moving across the globe. Those other species speciate in those places, and that's how we get them into us. The land bridge theory is and isn't. So the current understanding is that there's a southern boat route that brings the first people of Homo sapien people here. There's already a species that is speciated from Homo erectus here that they meet up with when they get here. But the first Homo sapiens come across a southern boat route that goes across to Australia and does island hopping across the South Pacific. And this is over 35,000 years ago, probably closer to 50,000 years ago with current evidence. Then we see that there is a transmission at roughly 20,000 years ago, what they call the Kelp Highway. And it starts 20,000 years ago and doesn't end until roughly 8,000 years ago, this Kelp Highway route, which is coming across a northern boat route using island hopping across the northern boat route. And then we see that the land bridge is open between 18 and 15,000 years ago. And while that land bridge is open, there is backwards migration. So there are people going from Turtle Island to Siberia, and there is some forward migration. But we do not see that as either the only route of travel or the major route of travel. And we see that there's as much backwards migration within that as forward migration. I think that Erectus gets, I don't know how Erectus gets here. I think that it could be boats, because if we look at Erectus going into like Erectus as Homo ergaster gets to the island of Flores, which has always been in water, right? Gets to the island of Luzonzensis, which has always been in water, somehow gets to Australia, which you've always had to cross water to get there. So Erectus is absolutely using boats. Is that how they're getting to all of these spaces? I don't know for positive. Or, like, is there another land bridge at 1,000,000 years ago that they're crossing, right? Did Erectus cross on a land bridge to get here, right? I'm not exactly sure. There hasn't been a whole lot of look, right? There hasn't been a whole lot of study of how Erectus gets here. The idea that Erectus got here is so relatively new within the theories and within paleoanthropology that there isn't a whole lot of look as to how that happens yet. There are probably people out there looking at it, and I haven't seen the studies on it yet. So it could be one or the other. It could be a combination, just like it's a combination for us, right? So when you see that migration around the world, we see that migration around the world happens roughly 50,000 years ago. This is the same time that Homo sapiens are entering into France. This is the same time that they're entering into the Iberian Peninsula. We see that 52,000 years ago is our current earliest sapiens in Western Eurasia, right? No, you're fine. And I can read Taiwanese like nobody's business. My second husband Taiwanese everything, and we did online role play together. And so he typoed everything, and we did online role playing. So I learned how to read Taiwanese pretty easily. So when we're looking at these migration routes, what we're seeing is that we do, as a species, all come from Africa, but the idea that we came out of Africa so long ago, or that different groups evolved outside of Africa, like different sapiens evolved outside of Africa, and therefore certain sapiens are more advanced than others, is incorrect. That goes along with that racism, the race theory, the racism within the theory of evolution, and old European white men trying to justify their atrocities when all of these thought processes are coming to being, right? So when we're looking at this prior to 10,000 years ago, we don't see that there is evidence of definitive violence in the archaeological record. We see again that there's about 2,000 individuals that we have, and of those 2,000 individuals, 2% of them died from outside means, right? We don't know if those outside means are a human causing that outside means, or a cave fall, or a saber tooth, or something else, right? None of the evidence shows something that we can go, yeah, that's absolutely violence. There's no other way. Now, I know that we've seen in the news recently that Neanderthals had cannibalism, right? Um, this should be understood that this doesn't indicate violence, right? If I'm eating somebody, there's several different reasons that I could be eating somebody, and it doesn't necessarily mean that I killed them. So, if there are many different groups throughout the history or prehistory of humanity that actually ate their dead. Like that was a method of imbuing the spirit of the dead within them so that they could actually carry on, right? So this is a religious or a ritual eating. So Neanderthals eating their dead could be this, right? There's also several instances that we've seen even within written history where the Donner Party gets, trapped in snow and can't hunt, and people die of starvation and they eat those who died of starvation. This isn't violence against the people who died from other reasons. It's survivability, sustainability, right? So cannibalism does not indicate violence. Cannibalism can indicate many different things. Just because that was one that got brought up recently, but it's not indicative of violence. At 10,000 years ago, we see in the archaeological record that not only is there a rise of things that can be attributed to violence, but we start to see things that can't be attributed to anything else but violence. One of the first ones of these is a massacre in Kenya at 10,000 years ago, where there are 8 individuals. One of them is a pregnant woman who is tied into a seated cross-legged, crisscross applesauce sitting on the ground cross-legged with her hands tied up underneath her belly, who is killed from behind, right? This is definitive violence. There's nothing else that this can be. We see evidence of massacres after 10,000 years ago. And we see that things that can be attributed to violence or are definitely attributed to violence goes up to 18 to 20% at 10,000 years ago. When we look at the things that are going on at 10,000 years ago across the globe, what we're seeing is the rise of stratification within society. Now, mainly this focus that I have, or the focuses of the studies that I have focused on or seen, have to do with the Fertile Crescent, right? This is where we see the very first start of what we consider civilization. I disagree that it is civilization. I don't think it's very civilized. But we see that start of cities. We see that start of agriculture based cities, and we see that start of stratification within society. Now, when we see that start of stratification within society and we see that start of agriculture based cities, we see this rise of violence that associates with it. Now, in these early cities, we don't have evidence of writing, right? So we have archaeological evidence, but we don't have conversations about, why, who's leading these things. When we start to see our first evidence of writing, now, first of all, I want to double down on the fact that we found out recently that Homo sapiens have cave writing at 20, like writing in caves, symbolism associated with words in caves at 27,000 years ago, and that there is evidence that Neanderthals were writing as well. Recent evidence shows that we could possibly see writing within Homo naledi, who is 335,000 years ago to 225,000 years ago. So writing can be that old. That study hasn't really been done. I've just seen pictures and I went, oh shit, that looks like writing. We do have recent studies though that have shown that there is writing 27,000 years ago in cave art, and that there is writing in cave art with Neanderthals. So this predates our current understanding of the written word, right? Because currently most people think of the written word as starting with cuneiform. It should also be understood, though, that cuneiform is not the first written word, even if we're not looking at cave art. When we look at the ancient Egyptians, if we look at Kemet, we see that the first start of writing starts with King Scorpion. King Scorpion's Scartouche. King's King Scorpion's cartouche is seen in a pass at about 5,000 years ago, right? This is double zero dynasty, right? And so we see that the first evidence of actually writing things down is hieroglyphics, if we're not looking at the cave art. So the idea that cuneiform is our first evidence of writing is incorrect. Cuneiform is our first what we call alphabet. There are different forms of writing. There are hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics are a form of writing that you can either denote the entire word or denote a symbol. And there are different little pieces that will tell you whether you're denoting an entire word or you're denoting a symbol. A cartouche is one of those pieces. So you see a cartouche around all these different symbols, and it says this is a name, right? Specifically the name of a king, usually, right? Um, FLID, do you have, or FL1, do you have a name of a site on that? We were just talking about there's some different sites that I've recently found and gotten information on that actually are 250,000 years ago, right? Stone tools, bifacial stone tools. So I'm not sure. And one of those things states that it could be this age or it could be that age. And some of it is closer to 80,000 years ago. So it might be one of those. Are we looking at the Calico site in California? That might be the Calico site in California. And the Calico site has two different datings on it. One of those datings is 200,000 years ago, and one of those is 70,000 years ago for the Calico site. I'm not sure if that's the one you're referring to. If you have like the archaeologist or a name, I can look it up and see if it's one of the ones that we've talked about. I'm always looking for more information on the changing of the dating of the Western Hemisphere. So that would be something that I would really love and enjoy if you have just any form of a name that gives me the ability to look it up, right? But that's amazing. I totally believe that. So our when we look at hieroglyphics, hieroglyphics are a type of writing that is usually very broad. There are other things that are hieroglyphic writing, usually very broad. And the symbol can either denote a full word or it can denote a syllable of a word, right? And there are extra little markings that tell you what it denotes. When we look at alphabet, we look at something that I think the top amount of letters in an alphabet is like 35, and the letters within an alphabet associate to syllables, not to whole words. When we look at runic is under 15 characters, I think it is. Maybe it's 18 characters, and each symbol denotes a word or a syllable. So phonetic, thank you. So when we're looking at cuneiform as the first writing, cuneiform is not necessarily the first writing. It is the first symbolism based on syllables instead of based on full words. And it is about how many characters are in that writing system more than anything else. And so when we look at the first documentation of what rulership is or what these ancient cities based on stratification are coming across, we can see some really interesting things. And this is where we start to see that deification of narcissism and that othering as a means of control and manufacturing of evil. So, as we were just stating, this is starting roughly 10,000 years ago, and we see a rise of violence in the archaeological record at 10,000 years ago, where we do not see any definitive evidence of violence prior to 10,000 years ago, right? So, at the same time, we see this use of monoculture agriculture or monocrop agriculture to start basing stratified cities. We see this rise of othering. Um, so what we're looking at is that the first writings in these areas talk about this. The first writings in these areas, if we look at King Sargon, we're looking at a king who is one of the earliest kings that we have writing of. Sargon is a king who was abandoned in childhood, put in a basket, floated down a river. Sounds familiar, right? And was taken out of the river by a gardener or a farmer, depending on the translation, and raised by this very poor human being, right? Depending on the translation, he's either a farmer or a gardener. This very poor human being raising him, he believes that he is the child of a deity of the river. So we see a child who believes that they were abandoned by a deity parent. And as they get older, they believe that being the child of this deity means that they should be worshipped, right? This is textbook narcissistic personality disorder, right? We're seeing a very traumatic, hi, Nicole. We're seeing a very traumatic childhood that creates this idea in one's head that they are actually very special and therefore should be worshiped, right? And so we absolutely see within our first kings, we see these God kings rising. Now, when you look at a king who believes he's a deity because he was abandoned and had a traumatic childhood, we can all see the textbook narcissistic personality disorder within that. When you look at these kings and the way they then start to build their kingdoms, you can really see it, because what they do is they start gathering a few people around them who generally are bullies, right? And they go and they start gathering other farmers, other people. I'll protect you from the barbarians who are coming down from the hills to steal your crops if you follow me. But you've got to give my people, you got to give me your food so that I can give it to my armies, so that my armies can protect you. Awesome sauce. Thank you. 1 second. Let me get a pen and paper and I can write it down. What is it? And when we're seeing that, we're seeing this rise of deification of narcissism, this rise of deification of being the child of a god, being special and important, right? Now, when we see that, if I am in charge of you and I am trying to maintain my in charge of you, thank you so much, and I'm trying to maintain my in charge of you, I need you to want to give me your food. And the way that we start with this, the way that we see that these kings are giving you a reason to give them your food, to give them your labor, right, is the barbarians in the hills are coming to steal your food. Now, after we see the barbarians in the hills are no longer there, that pretty much everybody's living in agriculture stratified based cities in the area, we see this rise of nationalism within the historical record, because at this point we are within a historical record. And this rise of nationalism within the historical record says our city is better than their city because our city has this art and they don't have that art, or our city is growing barley and their city is growing wheat, right? Thank you so much. I will take a look at it afterwards and see if it's one of the ones that I already have or one of the ones that I need to add, because I have a few that I'm trying to add so that people can get that information out. So when we see that rise within these cities of first this othering based on the barbarians in the hills, then we see this start of othering based on that other city is trying to steal your food and trying to steal from you, right? We then see it translate down as we go down. We see it go from first barbarians to nationality or city, state, to gender. We see the rise of othering based on gender in ancient Greece. This is our first evidence of this idea that women are weaker than men and therefore men should be in control. Before this, we don't really see that. We do see kind of Hammurabi is starting it a little bit, but not a whole lot. There's still very much rights for women and equity for women. We see that a lot of the spaces that they base their lineage on patriarchal lineage are patrilineal, which means who your father is, versus matrilineal, which means who your mother is. They are still, women are still given rights. Women are still given equity. When we start to see this idea that women are no longer given rights or equity, this othering based on gender, we do start to see this within ancient Greece, which carries down and becomes doubled down within ancient Rome, right? So then we start to see othering based on gender. After we see othering based on gender, we start to see othering based on religion. And we start to see othering based on religion when we start to see a monotheistic religion taking over as a state religion for a large empire, right? So the Judaic people are very much not a large empire trying to conquer all these other empires. That doesn't mean that they didn't conquer some peoples, but they're not out trying to conquer the entire globe. And because of this, because they're not trying to convert everybody to Judaism, you do not see that there is this othering based on monotheistic religion with, well, I mean, obviously they're staying there better and others are not. Yet we do not see it as a state thing until we start to see it within at 400, when we see that the Council of Nicaea creates the idea of Christianity as a state religion. When we see that the idea of Christianity as a state religion is created based on the Council of Nicaea, And based on Constantine the Great, what we see, yeah, Constantine and the Council of Nicaea, what we see is this idea that there is this idea that anything that is scientific or anything that is medicine becomes outlawed, is bad because it's questioning God and God doesn't want to be questioned, or it's playing God and you can't play God, right? And at this point of time, we see this idea that other religions, other countries whose religion is not based on the same monotheistic deity, and it is definitely based on the same biblical monotheistic deity, because we do see that Islam is based on the same deity and is in part based on the same book, right? We see this othering based on religion start. My religion is better than your religion because your religion is sinful because you study science and medicine. After we see othering based on science or based on religion, we start to see othering based on skin type, skin color. And we see that othering based on skin color or phenotype start in, it really kind of starts slightly before the arrival of the Europeans in America, but it really doubles down with the arrival of the Europeans in America. And that arrival of Europeans in America, they start to use othering based on phenotype so that they can, at this point, they're looking at a group of people that has advanced science and has advanced medicine, and yet they consider them the children of God. They consider them close to God. So I can't state that you're sinning because you're using the science and medicine. I have to figure out another way to other you, right? The Crusades didn't help. And I'm sure the Crusades actually absolutely attribute to phenotype othering, right? Because you get Europeans versus the Islamic people who in the space of the Crusades are actually what we would consider brown, right? And so I'm sure that it does see somewhat of a start with that. And it probably sees somewhat of a correlation with sin early on, because you see that that rise of othering based on phenotype as it rises really becomes they use the Bible to justify it, right? It's considered the mark of Ham, this child of Cain. And because Ham was marked with dark skin, according to Christians, anybody who has darker skin is therefore not chosen by God, right? And so they can other based on that. As we see this start to move down, we see that the next level of othering really becomes, it kind of reverts back to that nationalism a bit, right? So we start to see immigration becoming a level of othering, right? And then after that, we start to see houselessness becoming a level of othering. Currently, our major level, I mean, we're definitely still very racist here in the US, but our major level of othering in the US is immigration based on racism and houselessness. We very much other our houselessness. People who have been exploited for all their worth and are no longer exploitable, and therefore they are a husk left to society's standpoint. Now, this is definitely, without a doubt, and you can see it from its start and every step of the way down, a means of maintaining control. Again, we have the narcissistic God kings. We have this deification of narcissism. And this deification of narcissism, this deification of these narcissistic God kings, when you see them trying to maintain control, and we all kind of know this, right? We all really get the fact that, you know, if I can convince you that I'm not the problem, that somebody else is the problem, then you're not going to attack me, you're going to attack that somebody else, right? um, you know, a lot of times we talk about in marginalized communities, we talk about the fact that, you know, like if the indigenous people and the black people in the United States combine, we are all, I mean, like we outweigh the 1% by millions of people, and we could absolutely take out the 1%, right? um, if the 1% can convince you that it is not them that's the problem, but it is in fact somebody else that is the problem, then the 1% protects themselves, right? If the narcissistic God kings can convince you, if the government can convince you that it is not them that are trying to take from you, but is in fact somebody else that's trying to take from you, then you are going to allow them to continue to take from you, right? Welfare is a really good example of this, right? We talk a lot about welfare queens and things like that. The thing is even if you're working and paying like high tax brackets, you're only paying like $35 a year to welfare. You are paying $5,000 a year to the military complex. You are paying a couple of $1,000s a year to pay for the senators and the people in the House of Representatives. So you are paying the wages of the public servants, as they like to call themselves, who are telling you that it's not their $2,000-3,000 wage that you're paying, it's the $35 that you're paying to make sure that a child eats. That's the problem, right? Now, we all are really well aware of this, and yet we like to think like both sides of the coin right now are definitely like the government's out to kill us. It doesn't matter if you're right. It doesn't matter if you're left. Left isn't really right, or left is more right than it is left, right? But it doesn't matter which side of that coin you are within our current division society, right? We all know that the government is really out to get us. And we all know that until the government tells us it's somebody else, right? Like we saw this in 2020 when people are like, the government's paying Antifa. Nobody paid me shit. Like, I don't know a single person that got paid, right? So we definitely see this thought process translate down into many different ways, all of them about getting you to believe that it is not the government who is maintaining control over you, who is harming you, but it is in fact your next door neighbor. Because if I can get you to believe that it is your next door neighbor that is harming you, instead of understanding that it is me that is harming you, then you're not going to attack me. You're going to attack your next door neighbor. Your next door neighbor is as poor and broke as you are. So it's not like they can attack you back, or if they're going to attack you back, it's going to be on the same level. But as long as you two are fighting each other, you're not fighting me, right? So this is where we see othering as a means of control for that narcissistic God King, 1%. However it is now, I still call them the narcissistic God Kings because it works for me. When we see this, we also see this rise of narcissism as being a holy thing, right? This idea that being a narcissist is an okay thing. We see this really coming about by the Bible. And the reason we see this really coming about in the Bible is because God is a narcissist. And if you read the Bible and you actually read through it, you will see and you understand what NPD is, right? And you understand the tactics that NPD abusers use. You will absolutely see NPD within Yahweh. I have a Bible somewhere around here. Okay. I don't know where my Bible is today. I have a new Oxford edition. So one of the most correct translations you can get, NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. When you look at Exodus, you see that God tells Moses, go to Pharaoh and ask Pharaoh for this. And Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, hey, I'd like to leave so we can go pray. Okay. And Moses goes back to God and says, okay, I told him. And Pharaoh goes, I'll think about it. That sounds reasonable. You just want to go outside the city to pray and you're coming back. Okay, that sounds reasonable. And Yahweh, or God, tells Moses, well, hold on a second. I'm going to go and harden his heart. So he goes to Pharaoh and he tells Pharaoh, don't do this. I know he's telling you to do this. I know he's told you that I told you to do this, but don't do this. And then God goes back to Moses and he goes, okay, I hardened his heart. You can go back and get it. And then Moses goes to Pharaoh and Pharaoh goes, nah, I changed my mind, man. God told me to do differently. And then God punishes Pharaoh for doing what God told Pharaoh to do, including killing his child, right? This is narcissistic parenting 101. This is division of your children, right? And this is punishing your children for doing exactly what you tell them to do. And God literally tells Moses in Exodus, the reason I am doing this is so that your people will laud my praises for all eternity. So the reason that I am abusing the Egyptians, the reason that I am abusing you, because I'm making you stay here and go to Pharaoh every day and ask for something that Pharaoh's more than willing to give you, but then I harden his heart so he won't give it to you. The reason I'm doing this is so that you'll laud my praises for all eternity, right? So this is absolute narcissistic parenting. When you look at this story of Job, where Job believes in God more than anything on earth, and as a bet, God takes everything away from him, right? And never returns it. Like he doesn't return the child that was there before. He doesn't return the wife that was there before, right? And he says, well, I'm glad you proved yourself. I'm glad you proved your love to me, right? So this is, if you look at narcissistic parenting and narcissistic personality disorder, this is like textbook, right? Now, we've been taught as a society, for the most part, though those of us who are not Christian or raised Christian, we're not taught it as much, though it's still so prevalent within our society. We are taught it somewhat, that we should try and be godlike. What would Jesus do? What would God do? How should we react in a godlike way? God is a good, loving parent. And when you're gaslit with the idea that narcissistic parenting styles is a loving parenting style, and so you parent in this way, because you're a loving parent, you're using abusive tactics to parent, right? And so we can see where narcissism has been taught, the tools of narcissism has been taught as parenting tools that are positive, as relation tools that are positive. You should have control of your wife, you should have control of your family. And the way to maintain control of your wife or to maintain control of your family is to act like God, to be as close to God's behavior as you can, right? So we can absolutely see where this deification of narcissism, this deification of narcissistic tactics, and this deification of NPD comes into play. We also can see where the rise of the gene for narcissism comes into play throughout society, because we have all been trying to marry the higher ups. If the only people in your community who are eating are the kings, you try and marry the kings. If the only people in your community who are going to have food on their table every day of the year are those who are ruling, you try to marry into the ruling family so that you can ensure that your children have food on their table every day of the year. So you see this rise of the gene for narcissism coming about because of the fact that we are trying to marry into this narcissistic gene family so that we can subsist, that we can survive, right? And again, this is starting with stratification at 10,000 years ago. This is starting with that first idea that somebody should own land. Now, for me, I trace this all back to the ownership of property, because when we start owning land, we start looking at land as something that can actually be possessed instead of something that owns itself. We dehumanize land. Now, animism, which is who we all were beforehand, states that everything has a soul, everything is equal and equitable, right? The entirety of the biome has equity, has equality, right? And when you start saying that one piece of the biome no longer has control of itself and can be owned and possessed by something else, then you start saying that everything in the biome can be owned and possessed by something else. So we start with land, and then we get to the plants and the animals in the biome, and then we get to other humans and the idea that you can own other humans, right? So this is where we can see that rise of narcissism along with that deification of narcissism. It is good to be a narcissistic parent. I'm Indigenous, land back every day of the week. All of this conversation is so that you can understand that land back is the only way out of it. Okay? So I'm not getting political. I'm teaching you history. I'm teaching you who we were so that I can show you, A, where you're being controlled by others, right? Where this government is trying to control you and trying to harm you. They don't give a flying fuck about you. Okay? And so that I can show you how we are nurturing and communal. So taking care of ourselves and being communal with each other is a very natural way of being. And living in a society that is not nurturing and not communal actually creates depression, which is a healthy reaction to a horror show, right? And because the only way that I can think of that we can stop the mass extinction of our species, because we are the first species is going to cause their own mass extinction, is land back. Returning the tending and governance to Indigenous peoples across the globe will stop the destruction that is happening. We are currently, global warming happens, global cooling happens. This is a cycle, right? Climate destruction is something that we are causing. And we are causing climate destruction because of all of these reasons I'm just talking about. This is what's causing climate destruction. And so if we can return tending and governance of the land to the indigenous peoples across the globe, because there are indigenous peoples and everywhere across the globe, there are indigenous communities that have maintained indigenous practices through colonizations. Some have been being colonized for 1,000 years, that have maintained indigenous practices through thousands of years of colonization. And if we can return the tending and governance of land to indigenous people across the globe, then we can stop the climate destruction that is happening. And if we can stop the climate destruction that is happening, we can reverse it and stop the destruction of our species as a species whole, right? I'm globally mixed. I have indigenous history and ancestry everywhere. I have Turtle Island indigenous ancestry and was raised in Turtle Island indigenous communities. Yeah, I figure we're talking to somebody who's ethnocentric. I can see that. So this is my land. Really? Can you tell me, have you done your DNA? Because I've done my DNA, and I'm related to Kennewick Man, who's 10,000 years old here, locally here, like where I live here. Okay. And I'm also related to the Clovis people who are 12,000 years old, locally here, like here. How about you? Where are you related to? This is my space. My ancestors have been here since prior to 1492. Half of my ancestors have been fighting against this colonization the entire fucking time. Now, obviously, because you can see it looking at me, the other half of my ancestors have been colonizing the entire fucking time, right? But if you want to participate in white supremacy, you continue your participation in white supremacy. Do it elsewhere, though. I don't deal with white supremacy in here. White people aren't the go-all, be-all. And as long as you're participating in white supremacy, you can take it somewhere the fuck else. Because I don't deal with white supremacists. And I don't care what your phenotype is, you can be a white fucking supremacist. And if you are contributing to the erasure of a people and your own people, then you are a white supremacist. And you can take your white supremacist out there. Out. Go else. Okay? Take it elsewhere. Or you can shut up and learn to listen. Just a thing. If you're truly indigenous, it's something that you will do naturally because you're not a white supremacist. There are sites that you can take your GED match will match you to different there's several different different sites will actually match you to archaeological sites. And my inwit.org website, under DNA as a tab, there are DNA resources as a tab. There's about 3 or 4 different sites, and 2 of those sites will match you to archaeological finds. One of them is My True Ancestry, and the other one is GEDmatch, GED Match. And it will match you to archaeological finds across the globe. And that's how mine is matched to Kennewick Man and to the Clovis. We only have one DNA from one Clovis human. So you can take that DNA and match it to different people who have been here, right? It is kind of hard to read correctly. To match to like the archaeological sites, it's a specific tab underneath the GEDmatch. Let me go into GEDmatch. Let me go into GEDmatch and I'll see if I can tell you what tab you can go to that will tell you that. Maybe. In a minute. No. Okay, so it's not that one. Ha 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 ha. So under free tools is archaic DNA. It's the second from the bottom. If you are in GEDmatch, across the top it says Home, Upload DNA, and Free Tools. On the Free Tools is a drop down. And the second to the bottom on the Free Tools says Archaic DNA Matches. And if you go to that and you choose your kit number, and then upper segment threshold limit has like a few different things. I just put it at 0.5 cm for mine. And when you do that, it'll pull up. The person in the picture behind me is a Gradacian man from about 18,000 years ago. I'm going to show you the website here really quick. So I went, let me go back through it. I went here to free tools, and I went down here to archaic DNA matches. Then I went here. I'm not going to show you what my kit number is because it's got my name on it. And then it doesn't now. And then I chose, and you can drop down menu this, and it'll give you this. More CMs indicates a closer match. I just went with 0.5, matched with ancient DNA. And then you can see here, this second one is a Neanderthal. I have one match right here. Here's a hunter-gatherer at 7,000 years ago in Sweden. As you can see, there's a lot of matches there. Here is Ireland at 2,000 years ago. It's almost all orange. If you go down, there's Bell Beaker and stuff like that. Ireland, Georgia, Russia, Germany, Iceman. Here's Otzi. I am not related to Otzi at all. I'm trying to find, I know it's on here. I just want to figure out where it is so I can show you. Turkey, Spain, Germany, Hungary, Turkey, England. Where is it? Ah, there's a Denisova on here. I did not realize that. So I actually do have Denisova DNA. Did not realize that. That must be a new one because I don't think I saw it before. Here is Clovis, Montana at 12,000. And as you can see, it's pretty yellow for me. And then I know oh, where is he? I've seen him on here. I don't know where he's at right now because this is a huge ass list and it can be a little bit hard. But Kennewick Man is on this list. I'm just not exactly sure where he is right now. But you can also look at this and see Kennewick Man on this list when you're looking at GEDmatch. And so you can actually match your DNA to people who were here 10,000, 12,000 years ago. As I was showing, Clovis is 12,000 years ago. And there is only one Clovis find that we have that has DNA off of it. And honestly, I can't remember what that DNA is from. Oh, there's also Greenland on here as well. I didn't realize that the Greenland was it. This is all free stuff on that site. You have to get your DNA from another site like 23andMe or Ancestry, but then you upload it to this site and it is free. The only one that I've ever paid for is my DNA test. And then I did pay on Ancestry to use it to search my family tree because I went to Ancestry to find my bio father. That's why I got my DNA, right? No, Clovis DNA is only in Turtle Island. Clovis is only Turtle Island. There is a time period in France that is considered like there's a king in France that was named Clovis. But when we look at Clovis DNA is absolutely only here in Turtle Island. Let me see if I can find, let me look really quick and see if I can find where Kennewick Man is on this page so that I can show it. It'll just take me a minute to kind of like look deeper in because of the fact that it's all like small white on black writing, which is a little bit harder for me. Sorry, I know I'm not talking through doing this. It's just that it's easier for me if I'm kind of more focused on this to try and figure out where it is. I have to use my finger to go down all of them because I'm having a hard time. Yeah, my ADD is not working right now with this. So I'm not finding it. I have seen it on here before. I'm not finding it on there right now. Um, and it could be like if it's not on anybody's, because like it even has on here the ones that you're not related to. So it's not like they took it off because I'm not related to it. Um, it could be It could be that they pulled Clovis or Kennewick Man for a reason, and it's not there. It did. Yeah, I have seen it on there. I do still see Clovis, and I do see the Greenlander. Um, I don't like the way they've titled this because they're using the E word to title the Greenland DNA. But I do know that or Kennewick Man has been there in the past, and that I have DNA in common with Kennewick Man. I just can't find it on there today. And I'm sure that it has a lot to do with my ADD and it's just not focusing right. But um, you can go on there and you can find those different things within them, right? And you can use your ancestor, your 23andMe DNA to do it, and it is for free. Those are all free tools, and you just have to upload your DNA to the site, and it'll do it for free. So let me pull YouTube back over here. So when we look at these things, we can see where othering is manufactured. Othering is something that the narcissistic God Kings are using to maintain control over you, right? And in that need to maintain control over you, they are manufacturing that evil as well. They're manufacturing that evil through things like we were talking about earlier. If you convince people that sex is a sin and that their natural desire for sex is a sin, then you convince them that it's taboo. And when we convince somebody that something is taboo, then we make it, for some of us, we make it more desirable, right? And so when we do that, we can create within somebody who may not have been somebody who's going to attack people, somebody who is going to attack people. Absolutely, Brahman. And so we can see where we can manufacture evil within humanity through that. We can see that we can manufacture traits that are toxic to us through that, right? Again, no species develops as a species with traits that's toxic to the species development naturally, like logically. Like if you look at it, nothing is going to. The whole point of species continuation, right? The whole point of adapting and becoming a species is so that you can fulfill a specific niche and so that your species is healthy and whole, right? No species out there actually is naturally intended to things that are toxic to it. Now, that does not mean that mutations don't come along, right? Things like inbreeding can create mutations. Environmental factors can create mutations. Nurture versus nature, right? That nurture can create, that makes sense. That nurture can create that issue, right? And so we see that the mutations that we see that are created within us are definitely mutations. They're not things that are natural to us as a species. And so we see that things that are toxic are definitely things that are manufactured. whether that manufacturing is through nurture or that manufacturing is through radiation. These are definitely things that are manufactured, these mutations within us that are toxic to our species development, right? And the idea that we are all evil is manufactured. This idea that we are all born innately evil and that we must be baptized, we must come to God, we must achieve some form of perfection to not be evil is absolutely manufactured, especially with that deification of narcissism, right? When you deify narcissism, when you make narcissistic parenting tools the way that other people are supposed to parent, and everybody starts parenting with narcissistic parenting tools, and they create children who are harmed, right? They raise children in toxicity. And by raising a child in toxicity, you create that problem within that child where there was not a problem within that child before, right? You create that trauma. A really good example of this, I think, for a lot of people is going to be residential school trauma, right? A lot of people want to state that people who are indigenous, might be, we talk about people who are indigenous having a higher level of alcoholism, right? That higher level of alcoholism is created out of the trauma that comes from residential schools, that comes from the attempted genocide, right? So when you take a child as young as 3 years old from their home and you put them in a space where they're being beaten and abused, assaulted, they aren't allowed to use their language. They're being traumatized on a daily basis, and tell them that the only way that they can get through that trauma is by turning to a God who is traumatic and evil in its own sense, right? And then you send them home to raise their children in that thought process. You are creating trauma that you're not healing, right? And so you're creating this cycle of traumatic parenting based on the trauma created by the residential schools, right? So the same thing when we talk about things like Black men leave their families, right? That's something that's created. That's not something that happens naturally. That's something that happens because of the prison to or the kindergarten to prison pipeline. That's something that's happening because drugs are flooding the streets by people trying to control from the outside. That's something that's created by Clinton putting 150,000 fucking cops on the streets, right? Those are things that are created. They are things that manufactured by the environmental factors around you, the environmental factors of colonialism and the environmental factors of genocide. And when you use those environmental factors of colonialism and genocide and you reiterate these things and you create these traumas, then you create passing down these traumas. There's no other choice sometimes, right? You don't see them as traumas because you're indoctrinated into them, right? And some of them, there's just nothing you can even do to change it. Like you can't stop your children from going to residential schools. You can't stop the cops from arresting somebody, right? So you create this cycle that is manufactured by those in charge to create division and trauma, right? So when we see these things, we have to understand the environmental factors behind them. And we have to understand the indoctrination behind them that creates them, right? And this is where we get this idea, or not this idea, but this knowledge that evil, the toxicity within us is manufactured, right? And it is definitely manufactured for that need to control, right? If I am stealing children from their home and indoctrinating them into residential schools, which by the way, every child fucking matters, and I'm creating a space where I'm indoctrinating them into trauma and then sending them home to perpetuate that trauma to create that genocide, that whole kill the Indian, save the man thought process, right? And so if I am creating that trauma and manufacturing that evil through indoctrination, right? This gives me the ability to maintain control. And when I create this evil, when I indoctrinate evil behaviors, when I indoctrinate toxic thought processes. And then I send people home, and then I tell this group of people to hate this group of people for what I indoctrinated them into, and tell this group of people to hate this group of people because I indoctrinated them into it. I use othering to maintain control over two different groups of people who would be better off if they united and said stop, right? So this is where we can see that our biological drivers are nurture. Our biological drivers are community. Our biological drivers are creativity. Our biological drivers are non-toxic to species continuation. Therefore, they're not violent, right? Those are our biological drivers. And yet when we deify narcissism and we make narcissism godlike, and we tell everybody that they have to be godlike, and we tell them that these are the things that they're supposed to embody, right? Deifying narcissism, manufacturing toxicity, creating toxicity so that we can maintain that control. And then we use othering, don't hate me, hate somebody else, telling people that Indigenous people get $1,000 a fucking month. I've never known a person on per cap that gets $1,000 a month. Not a single one. Telling people that welfare queens are Black women, right? When we create this idea that it's this person stealing from you instead of them stealing from you, then they maintain control over you. They maintain control over the entire situation, and they continue the indoctrination. And we continue that indoctrination in our schools. We continue that indoctrination in our public television. We continue that indoctrination in our churches. We continue that indoctrination down throughout the ages. We've gotten to the point where we're indoctrinating our children at home without even realizing it. Don't hit girls. Girls are weaker than men. Don't hit girls, when biologically girls are not weaker than guys. Biologically, men have more upper body strength and women have more lower body strength. And let's really talk about who's stronger. I'm never more of a dude than when I have a cold and I'm curled up going, oh my God, somebody save me. Yet as a woman, I can give birth, have 3 times naturally, right? That makes sense. So we can see within this that humanity is nonviolent because violence is toxic to us, that this othering is a means of control that is created, that evil is manufactured, and that deification of narcissism altogether combined takes away from our biological drivers. Now, our biological drivers being nurturing and communal and living in a space where there's no nurture and there's no community means that we are all, anyone who's healthy is depressed. Anyone whose mental status is not altered, right, by genes from narcissism or different things like that. Everybody who still has the need for compassion and empathy and community within them ends into an anxious, depressive state, right? If you are depressed when society is toxic, that's a natural reaction to the toxicity you see around you, right? Think of, watching somebody being harmed, watching a child being harmed, right? If you have compassion and empathy, you can't watch a child being harmed without feeling sadness. You can't watch an animal being harmed without feeling sadness, right? Yet, if you have no compassion and empathy, you can, right? So when you are watching the world burn around you and you're feeling depressed and anxious, these are healthy responses to an unhealthy society. These are healthy responses to an unhealthy manner of being, right? So it is only those of us who can see, only those of us who can understand that can affect change within it. You are necessary, especially if you're one of those people who looks around you and goes, God, this hurts. This is not okay. We need to change this. No. I mean, maybe I explained how they came into being, right? Like, absolutely, pro-life movement is absolutely deification of narcissism, othering as a means of control and the manufacturing of evil. Yes, absolutely. That is the pro-life movement. You're right. because the pro-life movement is absolutely that. I need to maintain control over somebody else. I think that I should be in control over women's bodies. And Lord knows they never actually like take care of the children that are born, right? So absolutely, that is, where that kind of comes in, right? And again, that deification of narcissism really gets into it too. That religious thought process and the thought process that my religion should matter to you. The thought process that my religion should have some method of control over your being absolutely comes within that. Yeah, I can totally agree with that. So when we're looking at those things, it's important to understand, because if we can understand, then we can change it, right? As we're sitting here depressed, as we're sitting here in pain, if we can understand why we're depressed and why we're dealing with that pain, then we can absolutely change it. And again, for me, this is always going to revert to land back on a global scale, because when we return tending and governance of the land to Indigenous groups across the globe, then in returning that tending and governance to the land and Indigenous groups across the globe, we reverse climate destruction. And again, global warming happens. Climate change happens. There are cycles that we go through, right? Everything in this world changes. The idea that things don't change is really egocentric. Everything in this world changes. Climate destruction is a completely different thing. And climate destruction very much comes out of monoculture and out of the idea that the earth is not alive in its own thing. Permaculture is permaculture is an appropriation of Indigenous honorable harvest. Permaculture takes Indigenous honorable harvest and turns it into a modern thought process, right? Permaculture has a lot of benefit to it. The problem that I have with permaculture is the fact that it is an appropriation of Indigenous honorable harvest without giving credit to the Indigenous people who created it, right? Where it comes from. But yeah, I have looked at permaculture. Did you hear me, smartest idiot? I love how you like to come in here. Did you listen? Because you don't seem to listen when you come in. What was the phrase that I stated? Because the phrase that I stated is global warming and cooling happens. It's cyclic. Mass glaciation, non-glaciation, these things happen. This is cyclic. Okay. This happens naturally across our planet. Climate destruction is an entirely different thing from global warming or climate change, which is a natural thing that happens. We all change. Change is inevitable, right? Change is a positive. There is a difference between climate change, the cycles of the planet, right? And climate destruction, which is what monoculture and Western thought is creating. Monoculture, Western agriculture, and Western thought process are creating climate destruction, which is an entirely different thing from climate change. Again, climate change happens naturally. Change is always happening, right? Climate destruction is something different. California is one of those really good evidences of climate destruction, right? So climate destruction is where you see an entire biome space destroyed, and it changes things in a way that climate change, the natural cycle of the planet itself, which is alive, happens. So when we see Western agriculture get to California and to the Great Plains, in California especially, we see that Western agriculture takes the Great Plains within California that are already there, that are extremely thriving biomes that provide everything needed for the Indigenous groups of people that are living there at the time, the Indigenous communities that are there at the time. And in coming through and slash burning everything and ripping out all of the plants that are naturally in the soil and removing all the animals that live within the plant structure of that biome, and then planting monocrop. Monocrop doesn't have nutrients in the land. So like if I have a biome, that biome itself provides all the nutrients needed. So you have, say I have a little forest biome, okay? And my little forest biome has some trees, and it has maybe some sweetgrass, and maybe some strawberries, and maybe some honeybees. And maybe it has a river, a little stream, and it has cattails, right? So the tree is providing nutrients to the strawberries and to the cattails and to the sweetgrass. And the sweetgrass is providing nutrients to the strawberries and to the tree and to the cattails. And the strawberries are providing nutrients to the sweetgrass and the cattails and the tree. All of these things working together provide each other nutrients, right? And then you bring in like the fauna as well, like the worms digging through the earth and leaving little things behind in the earth, or creating nutrients for the other things within this tiny little biome that I have. Now, if I come in and I strip out everything in that biome that's nurturing that biome, that's creating nutrients for that biome, and I replace it with something that doesn't come from that biome and it has no nutrients, first of all, my crops tend to fail. They'll live for a couple of cycles because they'll rob the land of what nutrients remain from all the things that I ripped out. But because those nutrients aren't being replaced, they won't live longer than a couple of cycles. So this is what happened in California. There's an old song that my dad used to sing, and it goes, "Think you're going to a sugar bowl, but you're going to a dust bowl. Here's what you find." This was a huge problem during the Depression, in fact, is they created this huge dust bowl where they used to be able to grow crops, and they could no longer grow crops because they had ripped all the nutrients out of the space, planted a singular crop that only robs nutrients and doesn't provide nutrients, because you need things that provide nutrients to each other, right? So it rips out all the nutrient in the environment and replaces it with something that is not providing nutrient to itself. And then that something robs the soil of all the nutrients that you're not replacing. And because the top layer of soil is held in place by the roots of the plants, and you've gotten rid of all of them, and you no longer have any nutrients because you planted a crop that just eats up all the nutrients, you create a dust bowl. You create something that is incapable of supporting itself, and now it becomes a wasteland. Our first agricultural based city is Angazal. Angazal happens, oh, I had the river last time. I had the river last time. Haha. Near Amman in Jordan. Okay, so Angazal is mid 8th millennium BCE, so that's 10,000 years ago. It's one of the largest sites in the region. It had approximately 2,500 to 3,000 people. In 300 years, it took a fertile river valley to a wasteland because they ripped up all the nutrient giving life in that fertile river valley and replaced it with emmer. And in replacing it with emmer, which is, I think, an ancestor wheat or a type of wheat, replacing it with that, they replaced it with a monoculture. They also did animal herding and animal husbandry. And so they rip up everything and replace it with something that doesn't provide nutrients. And because they rip up everything and replace it with something that doesn't provide nutrients, the nutrients that are there get robbed from the soil by what they replace it with. And in 300 years, it causes climate destruction in Amman, Jordan, right? So we can see that from its very first advent outside of the Nile River, which is the only place on this planet, really, that I have found at least, where monocrop culture or monocrop agriculture actually works. And again, that's because every year the Nile floods, and every year that flooding of the Nile replaces the nutrients in that space. So in any space that doesn't have that yearly replacing and replenishing of nutrients, monocrop agriculture does not work. Okay. And we've known this since our very first developments of monocrop agriculture outside of the Nile River Delta, or Nile River Valley. Now, because we can see that, we can see where monocrop agriculture is causing climate destruction. Again, not climate change. Climate change is natural, but climate destruction. And that climate destruction is depleting our oxygen. It's making it to where you're going to die, like a couple generations down, right? And until we can get rid of that monocrop agriculture thought process and return it to indigenous tending of the land, right? Which again does not remove things, right? Does not remove the biome because you need everything within a biome. Think of your body, right? Um, if you remove one element from your body, the rest of the body breaks down. If you remove all the iron from your blood, the rest of your body breaks down. Your body is a biome, right? And if you strip a nutrient out of it and don't replace it, your body breaks down, right? And so the earth is a biome as well. When you strip things out of it and don't replace it, that biome breaks down, right? And so that's what monocrop agriculture has done. Okay. Now we see that there are different indigenous groups who planted and tended. Tenochtitlan is a really great example of uh, building farms that are aquaponic, right? Uh, Taking a river or a lake bed and creating aquaponic farms within it, right? And planting different crops within that aquaponic. Now, the aquaponic planting still provides nutrients because you're not removing things like the fish, right? You're not removing the other plants that are around that are creating those nutrients, right? So that is a way that you can grow a singular crop and plant a singular crop in an area and still provide the nutrients. There are nations in the islands of the South Pacific that have also been doing that for like 7,000 years. We have islands in the South Pacific that are 3,000 years old that show where they took and they built more of the island using stones and created gardens using stones in the ocean, right? And that aquaponic created a better biome for the crops to grow in a nutrient rich environment, right? So there are ways that we can do monocrop without removing the entire biome and the nutrients in the biome surrounding it, right? But when you're taking like in Gazal or like California, and you're removing all of the nutrients from the biome around it and replacing it with a monocrop that doesn't provide its own nutrients and doesn't really like bring in this doesn't really bring in that entirety of the biome to get there, right? That's a problem. Nice. So yeah, I think George Washington Carver, who was a black man, if you don't know, actually, and he also is like he brought peanuts in, and peanuts actually really help. And he taught crop rotation, right? And part of that was the bringing in of peanuts, actually. But yeah, most indigenous people well, and it goes back to that animistic thought process, that living in concert with the biome instead of trying to control the biome. When we try and control other things instead of living in concert with other things, that really creates a problem, right? It really creates this disconnect, right? And again, I find it all starts with that belief that you can own property, that you can own land, right? That belief that the land in and of itself is not its own being, right? That doesn't have its own autonomy, right? And when we can believe that we can control the land and that the land itself doesn't have its own autonomy, then we can believe that we can control animals and animals don't have their own autonomy. And then we believe that we can control people and people don't have their own autonomy. And when we can translate that down to where we're at today, we can absolutely see the problems that it causes within society. Now, let's talk a little bit about gender. Most people don't realize that we actually have three biological sexes. The difference between gender and sex is that sex is about the biology in the body, the chromosomes that your biology has, and gender is about identity. So when we're looking at biological sex versus gender, we can see that biological sex and gender are two different things, right? We can also see throughout prehistory and early history that there isn't a gender divider. Like there isn't this idea that there are women's jobs and men's jobs within prehistory. And there isn't this idea in early history that there are women's jobs and men's jobs. When we're looking at this um, division, I don't think I want that one. I think I want you. We're seeing that prior to the advent, current understanding of gender, that somebody's biological sex isn't really determining what they're doing within society. We see within Neanderthals that we've often heard of something called gender dimorphism, and this is the idea or the knowledge that within sapiens, on average, males, those who are biologically male, are larger than those who are biologically female. Now, I want to explain to you what average means because a lot of people don't get that. Average doesn't even mean the majority of the population. If you take 100 numbers and add them together and divide them by 100, you get the average of your numbers. Sometimes that number isn't even a number that's there, right? Like if you take 100 numbers and divide them or add them all together and then divide them by 100, you might come up with 33. And 33 wasn't even in your initial numbers, okay? So when we're talking about average, we're not talking about the majority of a population. We're not talking about a quarter of the population. We're talking about taking it all together and adding it up and dividing it, and then you get an average. That can be one or two members of a population. When we look at gender diaphorism within Homo sapiens, we see that on average, men are taller than women. When we look at gender diaphorism between Neanderthals, once we were able to start seeing the biological sex within Neanderthals, we see that on average, the female Neanderthals are actually larger than the male Neanderthals. So the gender diaphorism that we see within Homo sapien is actually opposite within Neanderthals. Now, Neanderthals and Denisovans and sapiens are the only species that we have genetics from so that we can see what the biological sex is. So we can't say what it was with Erectus or these other species that are out there. Usually, when we're looking, we use our current understanding, which means that we have named Neanderthals as female through the course of time that turned out to be male because we thought that females are shorter than males. In finding that the gender diaphorism within Neanderthals is different than the gender diaphorism within sapiens, we see this switch of some of our understandings of gender roles, especially with the Neanderthals. So when we look at gender roles with the Neanderthals, we see that our idea of the roles of biological sexes within Neanderthals is actually quite different. Neanderthals, it seems that the biological females with the Neanderthals are doing way more of the hunting and the hunting than the biological males with the Neanderthals. Now, when we see this, you are a pain in my ass. I don't know why you keep doing that. When we see this, this changes our understanding a little bit of ourselves throughout human history. And our current understanding and our current knowledge is that as our species is moving throughout, and when we look at what we call the hunter-gatherer groups, we see that it is actually both biological sexes that are actually out hunting. It is not just one biological sex that is actually out hunting. When we look through the history of our species and what we can see in the archaeological record, we can see that those who are biologically female through the course of human history have actually been going to war, have actually been our hunters, have actually been partaking in roles that we currently associate as being more male than female. Now, as we're looking back through this, it's very important to understand that these ideas of what male and female are extremely new for us. Well, we can absolutely understand that throughout the course of prehistory, there's absolutely, always those who are biologically female giving birth to children. We can also see that just because they're giving birth to children doesn't give them their actual like job. Like, oh, you give birth to children, so you have to stay in the house this entire time. We don't see that happening throughout the course of our history until more recently. Now, again, there are three biological sexes. These biological sexes that we have are male, female, and intersex. Intersex makes up roughly 2% of our population currently. That's the same percentage, though not the same people, as redheads and people with green eyes. These are all roughly 2% of our population. Again, these are not the same people. I'm not saying that all redheads are intersex. Yet we do see that it is the same population percentages that are making up um, these different things. So we all know that there's a lot of fucking redheads out there, right? Which, if we're looking at 2% of the population, it stands to reason that there's also a lot of intersex out there. Now, intersex can mean a couple of different things, and that's why intersex is the overall for it. Intersex can mean that you have an extra Y chromosome. Intersex can mean that you have an extra X chromosome. So we have 23 chromosomes in the human body, and these chromosomes make up the different things about us, like our gender or our sex, our biological sex. And when we look at these different chromosomes making up different things about us, like our biological sex, the only chromosome that applies to our biological sex is the 23rd chromosome. Hey, baby girl. The only chromosome that applies to biological sex is the 23rd chromosome. And when we look at the 23rd chromosome, that we can see that the 23rd chromosome doesn't necessarily always make up what we think it does. You can also find instances where somebody has two X's but has a penis. You can find somebody who has an X and a Y but has what appears to be a vagina. And then their balls drop at puberty and they become male. There's three populations, three communities on the planet. I think one is in Portugal. I can't remember where the other ones are, where there are children who are born who look biologically female at birth. And then at puberty, the testes actually drop and they become biologically male and are able to impregnate people. So when we're looking at our sexes, we can see that our current understanding as a public of what sexes is pretty false. We can see that there are three sexes biologically. Now, when we are looking at gender, again, gender does not equate biological sex, because gender is not about biology. Gender is about identity. It is about mental state. It is about who you feel that you are or what relates to you, as opposed to the physical makeup of your body. Now, somebody can be a dual gendered and be intersex, absolutely. But somebody can be biologically female and gender as male, absolutely. It should be understood that our ideas of what is masculine and what is feminine are extremely new to our species. It's only a couple hundred years old that we have this idea that you must be certain things to be masculine or feminine. Not only that, but our idea of what is masculine and what is feminine has changed significantly across the course of time. One of the things that I like to point out frequently is the fact that high heels start as a male thing, as a masculine thing. The color pink starts as a masculine thing. The color purple starts as a masculine thing. Lace starts as a masculine thing. Makeup starts as a masculine thing. These are all things that we like to think have to do with being female today, and yet through the course of history, they were actually masculine. They actually came from or were for males when they start. So not only is our idea of gender very new, but our idea of what different genders are supposed to do is very new. So when we look through the course of history, we see things like the Burqa warrior woman, who is the fullest warrior grave, highest ranking warrior grave that we have in Scandinavia. This is BJ 581. It's the grave that I actually work on studying. I haven't actually been to the grave because I haven't actually, I was scheduled and then 2020 happened. I think the purpose of gender is othering. I think the purpose of identifying you as being male or female based on how I perceive you is othering. I think it's to create this idea that one is supposed to be controlled by the other, or that you're supposed to embody specific traits. That's what I think the purpose of gender is, and the purpose of our concept of gender within our society. So when we're looking throughout history, we're seeing, especially now, as we're being able to biologically sex different groups of people, different archaeological finds, we're seeing that our idea of what biological sexes were doing what in our history is completely false. We're seeing that there is this absolute show that those who are biologically female are actually doing things that we attribute to biological males throughout prehistory, throughout human history. Our first author was female. Our ancient Egyptians, there's 17 queens in their own right on the rolls of ancient Egyptian kings. Many of our societies had queens early on. Our many societies, almost every society across the planet has had women who were fighters or warriors, as long as it's had men or maybe even over men being fighters or warriors. We have different societies where the women are the weavers and the men are the women are the hunters and the men are the weavers. So we see that across different societies, this idea of gender has not only shifted, but this idea of what gender means has shifted. And what each gender is supposed to do has shifted. So when we talk about sacred gender versus toxic gender roles within society, one thing that I like to make sure that people understand is that sacred gender isn't about identifying as a gender. It's about using the things that you're talented at to nurture. All biological sexes are required to nurture for the next generation to be okay. If we are not nurturing from all biological sexes, then we are teaching the next generation wrong, right? If we teach the next generation that only boys, play sports and that girls clean the house because one biological sex is cleaning the house and the other biological sex is out playing sports, then we are teaching children not to thrive, right? We're teaching children not to do the things that they're innately good at, things that sing to them. And B, we are teaching them that they are supposed to fit into some specific role when humanity is never fit into a specific role. There is this idea that we're all the same, that we all think the same, that we all act the same, that perfection is something that can be rated, and that there's only one form of perfect. And when we have this idea that all females are a specific way and all males are a specific way, then we ignore what sings to those two individuals, right? So if I look like a male and yet I really enjoy nurturing a child, and you teach me that there's something weak about nurturing a child, you're teaching me to hate that which nurtures me, right? So you're teaching me to be toxic to myself. If I am a female and I couldn't nurture a house plant, and yet you tell me that I'm not only supposed to give birth to a child, but it's my job to nurture that child, then not only am I harming myself by doing something that is totally antithesis to my natural order of being, but you're most likely harming that child as well because you're subjecting them to a person that doesn't want to nurture them, right? That doesn't want to do that for them, right? Yet if I realize that gender and biological sex have very little to do with what sings to a person, right? What gets their juices flowing, what makes them creative. If I understand that biological sex and even perceived gender have very little to do with that, then I create a society where people are doing what sings to them. And when we do what sings to us, I use that phrase as do what we like do what feels right, do what we're good at. When we do the things that sing to us, we're better at them. When you do things that sing to you, that make sense to you, that you're good at, you're better at them, right? But if I tell you that the only thing that you're allowed to do is hunt, but you're really, really, really good at weaving, right? Then I have lost that talent. As a community, I have lost that talent. And when we're looking at earlier communities, we have to understand that things aren't about what my perceived notion of what your biological sex states that you should be doing. Things are about what you're good at, right? If only a few people know how to flint knap, you don't give a flying fuck whether or not they have a penis or a womb. You care that they can flint knap because that's providing something for you, right? If none of the men in your group or the biological males in your group can hunt worth a damn. Every time they go out, they stumble over everything and they alert the game from a mile away. You don't want the men hunting. If, in fact, you have somebody who is biologically female who is really good at reading the tracks from game, that's who you want out hunting. And you don't give a flying fuck that she has a womb instead of a penis. You really care that she can tell whether or not it's a deer or a cat that just walked through your area. So when we look at gender roles in sacred gender, we have to understand that sacred gender is not about a role. It's about nurturing. It's about teaching a child to do what sings to them, right? If I have a child who loves the feel of wool, if I have a child who loves the feel of wool, and every time they touch wool, they're playing with the wool and they've already figured out how to spin the wool without a spindle, right? I shouldn't care what the biological sex is of the adult that's teaching them how to spin wool. I shouldn't care what their biological sex is. I should care that they really love to spin wool and they're really good at spinning wool, right? Thank you. And when we look throughout history, again, when we're talking, we've talked about the fact that early on, a lot of group, there's that difference between tribe and band. Tribe being your citizenship in a community is based on your genetic lineage, and band being your citizenship in a community is based on what you provide to the community. When we're looking at those things, we're not looking at what your gender is. We're looking at, or what your biological sex is. We're looking at what you contribute, what do you bring to the table, right? And if we're looking at nurturing a child, so that child that really likes wool, maybe they also really maybe they're very textural, right? Maybe texture is important to them, right? And that's why they really like wool. So one of the guys in our group who loves to weave, he teaches that child how to spin and how to weave. But because they're very textural and they really love texture, one of the girls in the group, one of the biological females in the group really likes making baskets, right? And so she goes and she teaches that child how to make baskets. And one of the girls in the group is really, really good at flint knapping. And because this child loves texture, she teaches this child how to flint knap. And then one of the people in the group is really, really good at creating clothing out of furs, right? And because this child really loves texture, that person teaches the child how to create clothing out of fur. Now, we don't even know what the biological sex of this child is, but this child has just learned 4 different skills related to something that really, really sings to them from 4 different people of different genders. And because they've learned those 4 different skills related to something that sings to them from a couple of different genders, they choose to really specialize maybe in flint knapping and weaving, right? Now, guy taught him weaving and a girl taught him flint knapping. Still doesn't matter what their gender is. They love doing those things. And so, because those things sing to them, they work really hard at them and they get really skilled at them. And so now we have an extremely skilled flint knapper and an extremely skilled weaver, and we don't give a flying fuck who, like, what their gender is, what's between their legs, whether or not they can give birth, you know. We give a flying fuck about the fact that, wow, we all have nicer clothes because we're not all wearing wool, or we're not all wearing fur anymore. Somebody learned how to weave, and now we all have tunics that are woven, right? So when we're looking at us throughout history, we are not looking at a species that looked at different genders as doing different things. We're looking at a species that looks at what sings to you. What are you good at? When you're good at something and you contribute that to society, then you contribute it in the best possible way. A, you're happy to do it, and B, you do better. You do better than somebody who doesn't like doing it is going to do, right? So when we're looking at gender roles, A, gender is absolutely out there. I personally identify as a two spirit, which means that I identify as both genders. Um, and sometimes I am gendered as male, and sometimes I'm gendered as female. And for me, it is about the way my body dysmorphia feels. Like, how does my body feel today? Do I feel male genitalia today, or do I feel female genitalia today? Right. Um, Gender exists because gender is about perception of self, right? Gender roles do not exist. The idea that you are supposed to be a specific thing based on what your perceived gender or somebody else's perception of your gender is again based on that othering, and again based on that need to maintain control. Because if I can create division based on how I perceive your gender to be, then you are less likely to be able to do the things that you want, and less likely to uh, be good at things. And you're also going to be easier to control because you dislike that other gender instead of disliking me, right? That's also where we get back to that othering based on different genders that we see starting with the ancient Greeks. So when we're looking at gender roles, gender role does not exist. When we're looking at gender, gender absolutely exists, and sacred gender exists. Sacred gender, though, is not about a sacred gender role. It is about nurturing. It is about being communal and providing to community, right? So it doesn't matter if my perceived self-perceived gender is male or female. It matters that I'm really good at talking, right? It matters that I'm really good at perception and therefore can teach. It doesn't matter what my perceived gender is. So, sacred gender is about understanding that I don't have a role based on what somebody else perceives my gender as, or based on what I perceive my gender as, but I have that perception of gender is not about how I am supposed to do things within society. The perception of gender is more about self perception, what feels right to me, right? So when we talk about sacred masculinity, sacred femininity, sacred or divine masculinity and divine femininity, the idea that sacred femininity is nurturing and sacred masculinity is protective is incorrect. Those both, their sacred roles are about nurturing in the way that they're supposed to nurture. And we need men to nurture as much as we need women to nurture. This idea that women are the only ones that are supposed to provide nurturing and men don't provide nurturing is not only harmful to our children, it is harmful to men. It's harmful to women. If men believe that their only job in this world is to go out and make some money so that they can provide the house, but it's my job to do everything else because they perceive me as a female, then the pressure is overwhelming. Not only that, but the things that make us happy, community, the love of our children, the love of our families, those things get pushed to the side, right? I have a partner who identifies as male. my male identifying partner is in their 40s, like I am, and grew up in a society that believes that those who are identifying as male, their job is to protect and defend, and their job is to provide. So, my male identifying partner has been raised their entire life to believe that their purpose is not to take care of the children, is not to clean the house, but their purpose is to go out and have a job, and that job pays the bills, and that somebody else does the other stuff because that's their job. So when my partner is getting older and is less able to do the job, the heavy work that they do, their sense of their worth starts failing, right? If your only thought process of your worth is based on a role that somebody else has provided for you, when you can no longer perform that role for whatever reasons it is, your sense of worth starts failing. Now, my partner provides 1,000 things besides money, and I don't really need my partner to provide money. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm broke most of the time. I'm okay with broke, though. Um, and I don't need my partner to provide money for me. What I need my partner to provide for me is a safe zone, is a space that I am safe and I can grow within, and I can and be comfortable and safe to do to grow within, right? Like many of us, I don't did not grow up in a space where it was okay to be myself and to follow the things that I enjoyed, right? So the provision, the providing that my partner gives for me that I need is not a financial provision, it's a base. It's that feeling of safety to explore who I am, right? But when we teach men that their only job is to provide the job, right, to work outside the home, which makes them exploitable, right? Teaches them that their only worth is in that exploitability. When they're not able to be exploitable anymore, we teach them that their worth is gone. If we teach a woman that her only worth is in giving birth and raising a child, what happens when the child leaves the home? Is their worth now gone, right? So when we teach people that their only worth is within the gender roles that we're providing for them, when they are no longer able to provide those gender roles, or if for some reason they're never able to provide those gender roles, we teach them that they have no worth, and they have worth. Again, my partner's worth to me has nothing to do with the income that they provide. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's nice to be able to have that extra income and for them to do things. Yet that does nothing for me compared to the fact that they give me a basis to be myself. Without my partner in my life, I wouldn't have written 2 books. I would not have had the faith in myself to do that because I would not, because I've lived in a life that has taught me not to have faith in myself, right? So when we look at sacred masculine and sacred feminine, we have to understand that sacred masculine and sacred feminine is about living up to what sings to you. It's about nurturing through what sings to you. So if what sings to you, no matter what your perceived gender or your biological sex is singing, right? If that's what you're good at, what you're talented at, and what brings about this faith in yourself and you really enjoy doing, it doesn't matter what your gender is. You are nurturing people through that, right? Whether or not you're teaching other people how to sing, whether or not your song provides medicine and healing, is doesn't matter. What matters is that you are providing nurture, you are providing through that talent that you have, that skill that you have, that skill that sings to you. So again, the idea that there are gender roles is the problem, right? And the sacred within humanity, the sacred within whatever gender you perceive yourself about to be, is that nurturing of the next generation and that nurturing of the rest of the community through what sings to you, not through what you're told is supposed to sing to you, but through what actually does sing to you, through what makes you wake up every morning, what drives you, right? And by nurturing those talents in others, you are creating an ability for the next generation to grow. You are nurturing the next generation. So when we're looking at sacred within gender, I just want you to understand that it's not about your gender. It's about understanding that there aren't gender roles, that nurturing and community and providing is across any gender and across any sex, again, which there are three, right? Because we have biological sex, male, female, and intersex, right? So the idea that your perceived gender or your biological sex has anything to do with what your role in society is where the fault is lying. I'm going to go ahead and open it up for some questions for a while because we've pretty much gone through every topic on the board, and we'll kind of discuss just random things for a while I finish up with what I'm doing here. And we've been going for about 2 hours and 40 minutes, so we might not go for too much longer. We'll see. Tend to only be able to go for a few hours at a time before my brain just kind of shuts down and socializing doesn't work anymore because I'd be agoraphobic if I could. So if there are any questions on the things that we have gone over, please go ahead and ask them. And if there's anything that you want me to answer, discuss that maybe we haven't gone over. I don't know if there's a shorter lifespan in any specific group. I do know that the word pygmy is considered to be a slur, just so you're aware. So I can explain how we get to being shorter or taller through evolution. This goes back to, we've talked before a little bit about island giganticism and island dwarfism, right? Let's take it to paleoanthropology for this, and let's take it to Homo florensis. Homo florensis at its height, its tallest height is 3.5 inches or 3.5 feet. So I think it's actually 3 feet 5 inches, so not quite 3.5. That's the tallest Homo florensis that they have. Homo florensis is considered to have gone into what we call island dwarfism because of where they're at. So island dwarfism and island giganticism affects all species, not just human species. And what it states is that if you're in a space that is a very small space that is isolated from other spaces, that's why they call it island, but it can be like, being in a mountainous valley where you can't really get out of that valley very frequently, or like maybe there was a collapse within that valley and so there's no longer a pass to get in and out of that valley. So if you are in a small space isolated from other peoples and you can't get out of that space, and the predators within that space are either small predators or non-existent, and the food within that space is not a whole lot, then you will start to shrink to accommodate. And this is because, you have less food, so you shrink so that you need less caloric intake. You don't have a lot of predators, so you don't need to be larger to defend against the predators. So this is island dwarfism, and it is likely where we get our shorter groups of Homo sapien from. Island giganticism states the opposite. Island giganticism is if you are, again, in an isolated space, generally an island, but it can be an entire continent like Australia or North America. And within that space, there are a large number of large predators, and there is an abundance of food. You're going to get larger. So that's island giganticism. You're going to become gigantic. This is where we see taller groups of sapiens. This is where we see that a lot of people here in Turtle Island are actually really tall, right? Personally, I think that relates to the species from Homo erectus. And I personally think that the giants that we have here in Turtle Island throughout written history come from that species that speciates from Homo erectus as a giant species, mainly because we have a lot of we've had finds here in Turtle Island, and also we have oral tradition here in Turtle Island that talks about the giants. So uh, and then because that species is likely the ghost species that we see in Turtle Island indigenous people and indigenous Avialians, this would equate why Turtle Island indigenous people have a tendency to be very tall in certain nations, not all nations. Some nations are actually rather short. So when we look at this, this island giganticism and island dwarfism kind of relates across human species, and that's where you're getting that presence of shorter people within Homo sapiens. Um, we do in Africa see all skin colors and all sizes, and all hair textures and all eye colors within Africa, within the continent of Africa. The continent of Africa is huge and through several zones of the equator. And there are spaces within the continent of Africa where groups of people have lived in isolation or semi-isolation. They recently just found what they thought was an extinct nation of Africans that is an indigenous nation of Africans that they had thought they killed off, like they just found it again. So, there are definitely spaces within Africa where people have been able to isolate. And so, uh, generally, those who are smaller, and again, that word itself is generally considered a slur, but those who are shorter in stature within Africa come from having that kind of isolation in a space that doesn't have a large number of large predators and doesn't have a large amount of food. It's not a country, it's a nation. And I saw it today. I don't remember what the name of the nation was. Um, fuck. I don't remember what the name of the nation was. It was one that I just found today, or an article that I was just that came across my feed. I get a lot of anthropology stuff across my feed just because I do a lot of anthropology, and I don't remember what the nation or what the country within Africa was. They found this group of indigenous people that they had thought that they had actually eradicated and genocided, but it is still actually there. I'll have to look it up and see if I can find it and give information on that again. But when you look across the entirety of the continent of Africa, you absolutely see that there are spaces within Africa that people have been able to isolate and get away from that thought process. The Basque people have isolated, right? There are nations in Turtle Island or in Abiyala who still have not been contacted. They're still not contacted, right? They're at Turtle Island. The guy that just died that they had across the news, the whole man is what they call him, because his entire nation died off before he did, and he was alone in Brazil, I think is what it was, and he dug holes for like the last 20 years as a singular human being. Like nobody else in his nation was still alive. I don't know if narcissism is redeemable. NPD itself, I don't believe is redeemable. From all of the from the psychology that I've read, I do not believe that NPD itself is redeemable. I do believe that there are a lot of people who use narcissistic tools that are not narcissistic, right? So again, we get back to if you have a Bible that's teaching you that it's okay to parent with narcissistic tools, then you parent with narcissistic tools because the Bible tells you so. And when you realize that those tools are narcissistic and you change them, you can absolutely change them. I don't think, though, that those who are diagnosed as NPD can change that diagnosis. I do believe that if you become conscious, there are people who are diagnosed as NPD who are aware that they're NPD. And I do believe that I've read of one or two that actually, tries to do better. I know that there was some guy on here who was talking about how he was diagnosed with narcissism and he tries to do better, though his doing better didn't really seem. But narcissism as an NPD is really this feeling that you shouldn't have to, like nobody else matters. You're the only one that matters. So most people diagnosed with NPD don't feel like they need to redeem themselves. That's why people will tell you that if you think you might be a narcissist, you're not, right? Because if you care, you're not a narcissist. If you're sitting here going, shit, I might be a narcissist, I might have to change this, or shit, that's narcissistic tools, I might have to change that, because I don't want to cause harm to other people, then you're not a narcissist, because narcissists don't really care. They don't have the ability to have compassion or empathy for others. That's literally like within the diagnosis, right? That it's a lack of compassion and empathy for others. And so uh, you can absolutely, if you feel like you want to, as a narcissist, do things so that you're not using narcissistic tools against other people. There is a gene for it. I think they call it the aggression gene or something like that, but I can't remember off the top of my head. And I do believe that we bred it into us. We were talking about that earlier when we start having narcissistic God kings, right? That narcissistic God king thought process, if you're trying to stay alive and you want to make sure your kids eat, and the only people that are eating are the higher levels of society and the stratified society, you marry into that higher level. Pretty much everybody on earth currently today is descendant from some king somewhere. Like really everybody on earth has the genes of some king somewhere. Unless you don't have any genes within you from Eurasia or Africa. Like unless you're like 100% indigenous Australian or 100% indigenous Turtle Islander or unless you're 100% from a space that didn't have kings, and there are spaces in Turtle Island. There might even be spaces in Australia. I don't know enough about indigenous Australia to be able to state that. But there are definitely spaces in Turtle Island that had kings and queens. But unless you are descendant from a space 100% that doesn't have any kings or queens, really everybody on the planet has some descendancy from a king or a queen somewhere. And because of this, the gene for narcissism, I personally believe, though not being a psychologist, I haven't really done a whole lot of deep in-depth studies because that's just not the space that I study too much of. I personally believe that is why we have such a high prevalence of narcissism within humanity today, is because of that marrying in, and because of the fact that we are really all at this point descendant from kings somewhere, right? Like half the planet is descended from Genghis Khan and the other half of the planet is descended from Charlemagne. And so with that, I personally believe that we have absolutely bred narcissism. And then you do that, and then you also most of the planet is controlled by a Bible that teaches narcissistic parenting. And when you teach narcissistic parenting, that narcissistic parenting style, the narcissistic abuse itself will create narcissism sometimes. Because of the trauma that is happening to children, it will create narcissistic personality disorder through the trauma, right? So to my understanding, and again, I'm not a psychologist, but to my understanding, to have NPD, you have to have the gene for narcissism, and then that gene has to be triggered. So you have to both have the gene and have a trauma that triggers that gene, right? So, and I do believe that you can create narcissism directly from trauma, but I don't believe you can create narcissism just from the gene alone. And again, not my forte, not my area of focus, right? So I don't know all the different things on it, and I could be wrong. If there is a psychologist in chat who knows differently, I encourage you to inform me. But to my understanding, we see that you must have, or you should have both usually to become a narcissist, right? And so if you have that trauma and you have that gene for narcissism, and most of our parenting styles are narcissistic tendency or narcissistic tools, right? Because we live in a society that teaches us that we're supposed to parent like narcissists, right? Then we create narcissism at a high level. And so my understanding is it's like 15% of the society belongs to the dark triad. The dark triad is not just narcissism. The dark triad is narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And so roughly 15% of humanity belongs to the dark triad at this point. Last numbers that I read on it. And so when we look at roughly 60% of humanity at this point belonging to the dark triad, it makes absolute sense that it's passing that along as well, right? That not only is it something that's getting bred within us, but it is something that, because we're using narcissistic tools to parent with, we are passing along to our children. Um, but again, like, that's not my when I talk about and I try to make sure I specify this, when I talk about looking at narcissistic god kings, I'm talking about looking at their childhood and looking at their behaviors. I'm not a psychologist, and I don't think that really anybody can diagnose. Even psychologists, to my understanding, don't really feel like they can diagnose like Henry VIII, right? Though most people will say that Henry VIII was a megalomaniac. So, uh, I'm diagnosing somebody throughout history without a degree in psycho or not psychopathy, but in psychology, right? I'm diagnosing it based on my experience with narcissism. I have, unfortunately, way too much experience with narcissism. I have a lot of, I have family members who are narcissistic, and I've married a narcissist or two. And so I'm looking at it through the lens of my experience and what I understand about these things, and then looking at it through the lens of reading history and seeing these things throughout history, basically. Um, hey, bird. They probably do estimate about 1 billion people have died since recorded history, which is a really good uh, uh, division line, right? Recorded history versus non-recorded history, right? Um, just because we're two different breeds, there's no H. And I only say that because any Sarah will tell you that there's a difference between Sarah with an H and Sarah without an H. We are literally two like totally different Sarahs. Sarah with an H has a tendency to be quieter. Not that they're any less weird, it's just that they're quieter about their weird. And Sarah without an H has a tendency to be very loud about their weird and very bright about their weird. And most Sarahs will. I'm with an H or without an H. If you're a Sarah and you're like, you meet another Sarah, you're like with or without, and they're like, and you can usually tell, right? How can we trust much of our history, which can be manipulated by the winners, conquerors? Honestly, I don't trust a lot of history. And I did history before I did archaeology. Like, I love history. Yet I realized that most of history is written by the conquerors, right? Um, and you see that kind of in the fact that we only count history that's written. History literally means written story, right? Yeah, I am. And since literally it means written story, we've actually discounted other histories that are out there. First of all, we've discounted written history that's out there. We like to think that the Celts didn't write things, but the Celts did write. Ogham is a method of writing that was used for many different. They wrote letters to each other, right? They just didn't write down science and certain things, right? They believed that certain things shouldn't be put in writing, certain things were put in writing, right? So the Lakota people actually have a pictographic writing style that they used to keep calendars and to keep records, right? So our idea that history is only what is written, right? And that only a specific type of writing constitutes written history. So anything cuneiform or descendant from cuneiform is what we consider as constituting written history. Even in that, we can see that there's a problem with history itself, right? There is a lot of vital history that we have lost. Vital knowledge, I would specify, that we have lost. And a lot of that comes from ignoring the oral traditions. So we think that history has to be written for it to be real. Yet we find that those cultures that had oral traditions, as opposed to like taught through oral methods that didn't write everything down, we've found that uh, writing things down actually reduces memory retention. So when you have a culture that is not writing things down, that all of their knowledge and their teachings come from oral teachings, then you see a higher level of memory retention, and you see that their stories, their traditions are actually more accurate. So those who do not have a written tradition but have an oral tradition, their oral traditions actually give a more accurate representation of things that happened than the written traditions give, right? So the sagas are oral traditions that were passed down to be written, right? So the sagas have a lot of truth in them, but they also have a lot of non-truth in them because by the time they're written down by somebody who is Christian. So in writing it down through a Christian lens, it turned Odin into the Allfather when he was never the Allfather. In fact, Thor is considered to have been the actual leader of the Nordic gods and not Odin, right? So when we look at things like that, we see that oral tradition is usually actually more accurate than written tradition, and that when you start writing it down, you start losing accuracy. History of the Sentinelese. So the Sentinelese, there are about 3 or 4 islands in that area, maybe a couple more. The Sentinelese are one group. The other islands in that area were colonized. There has been several attempts to colonize the Sentinelese, to mission to the Sentinelese, and almost all of those attempts. There were a couple early attempts where people were allowed on the island, but when it was seeing the devastation that they brought with them, they stopped allowing people on the island. Currently, to my knowledge, from the last information that I read on the Sentinelese, they are down to like 250 people. We don't have a lot of information on who they are, mainly because of the fact that we aren't really allowed contact with them, which I can't blame the Sentinelese. Everywhere that Europeans have had contact, they've caused mass destruction. So the Sentinelese, in seeing what happened to the other islands around them and in seeing what happened when the first Europeans were allowed in their space, have blocked that. And so our knowledge of the Sentinelese is pretty limited at this time because of those things. To my knowledge, the Sentinelese actually genetic or phenotypically look like a couple of different groups. There is phenotypically what we would consider Australian or Black people within the Sentinelese, and there's also phenotypically what we would consider Indian, as in India, people among the Sentinelese, from my understanding. There's also a record of escaped slaves and escaped prisoners who made it to the Sentinel Island. And there's also other islands around that where people were, that when those islands were taken over and colonized, people made it to the Sentinelese Island. And so there is a mixture of a few different phenotypes, ethnicities, though they would no longer be unique ethnicities, because the ethnicity now would probably be Sentinelese within this the Sentinelese people. Indians. Who do you mean, Stardust? Do you mean India, or are you talking about Turtle Island indigenous people? Turtle Island indigenous people would not have relation to the Sentinelese, to my knowledge. There is evidence of Australians making it to Abiyala, South America. There's Australian DNA in South American groups. But no evidence of Sentinelese making it here, and no evidence of Turtle Island indigenous people or Abiyalian indigenous people going to the Sentinelese Islands. There is evidence of people from India going to the Sentinelese Islands, yes. I am pretty much just open for questions right now for a little bit longer. We're at 3 hours now. I'll probably take off relatively soon. Just to give a chance for people to ask things that maybe they have been wanting to ask before and I haven't seen because I was concentrating on something else, or from today's live as well. but I'll probably only be on for like 5 or 10 minutes more, and then I'll probably go ahead and take off so that I can decompress. Decompressing is huge for me. I love humanity, but it can be a lot for me. While I'm looking at questions, let me go over again that biologically and innately, we are nurturing and communal as a species. As a species, we are not by nature, we are not violent. By nature, we are not into othering. By nature, we really couldn't care less what you look like. In fact, if you look different, we like you more. Haha. By removing them from my life. That's really the only way you can deal with a narcissist. You can either gray rock them if you must keep them in your life, or you can remove them. And I have to say that removing the narcissist in my life actually gave me room to grow and to be okay with myself. It took removing all the narcissists from my life before I was able to be me fully and completely. A lot of times narcissists will tell you that you can't do things and you can't accomplish things, right? So when you have a narcissist in your life, you're less likely to write the book that you want to write or go to school or things like that because somebody has been telling you the entire time you can't, right? Unfortunately for me, one of them has control over my children, my youngest children. And so I wasn't able to remove them from my life until they convinced my youngest children to stop talking to me. And when they were able to convince my youngest children to no longer talk to me, I was the silver lining. The only silver lining in that fact was that I no longer had to deal with him. He still tries now that my children are talking to me again. But because my children are both in their late teens, I don't have to talk to him for anything to do with them. They both have phones. I can work directly with them instead of working with him. And so I've been able to completely shut him out. He was at my son's graduation and tried to talk to me there. And I just gray rocked as much as I could, he definitely was pushing talking to me. Like he wouldn't let me not talk to him. And because my child was there, I had to talk to him because he kept talking to my child and making my child answer questions for her, ask me questions when I wouldn't answer them. And so I had to talk to him there. But for the most part, that's really the only contact I've had with him in over a year. And once you can remove the narcissist from your life, you are healthier. It takes a little while still. You have to get their voices out of your head, right? That voice in your head telling you that you're the problem, that you'll never amount to anything, that you can't do anything. Those voices in your head, you have to get those out too. And sometimes that takes counseling, right? But removal is the first step. You have to remove them, right? And for some of us, it's difficult. One of my parents is a narcissist. So in removing that parent, I lost my entire family. I don't speak to my sibling. I very rarely speak to my other parent. Every once in a while, they'll respond to a message I've sent them. Every once in a while, they'll message me. And that's the unfortunate thing about having a narcissistic family member is they have a tendency to alienate the rest of your family. They also have a tendency to pull well, I'm mad at them, so you have to be mad at them too. And any of us who have dealt with a narcissist knows that you either do what they say or you're in pain, right? So if your partner is a narcissist and you're not ready to leave or see their narcissism, or your parent is a narcissist and you aren't ready to see their narcissism, maybe you're the golden child, or maybe they just didn't harm you like they harmed your sibling. It's a little bit harder for you to see it. And a lot of times that means that you've been indoctrinated into this idea that your sibling is the problem in your life. And so, you kind of have to leave all of them. Hello, lovely sibling. And you have to kind of leave all of them behind. And it's hard. It's hard. I miss my sister a lot. I miss my dad a lot. And yet at the same time, I've developed anger towards both of them because they allowed my children to be abused. They allowed the abuse to continue with me. They can't stand up. And I understand, it's hard to stand up. And yet, to me, anybody who's complicit in allowing children to be abused is not okay. Some of us do things that are abusive without realizing it. Some of us have done things that we don't agree with our children, right? Some of us have had to take stock and take accountability. Some of us were raised with narcissistic tools, and we had to, or married narcissistic people who insisted that we use tools that we didn't want to use with our children, right? And so we had to take stock and take accountability. Um, that to me isn't, that's abusive behavior, but not being an abusive person, if that makes sense. Um, and so if that's what it is, then I still am not okay with the abuse, but I understand the need to unlearn tools, right? I understand the inability to see it, right? Um, Yet those who, with all evidence in front of them, refuse to protect children are not okay for me. And so, while I miss my sibling and while I miss my father, I have also reached a point where I'm angry. It's not okay to treat people like that. It's not okay to let somebody treat people like that, right? Um, so you might lose people in your life. I lost my children for a hot minute. My children took a year off of talking to me. My oldest child didn't talk to me for about 4 years, right? And then my two younger children didn't talk to me for a year. And I had to deal with that. That's a painful thing. I have always been, to me, mothering was always important. Being a mother has been important since I can remember. I raised my sister. I helped raise other children. To me, it's always been a very important factor of who I am. And it was something that I always wanted to be. And so losing my children was extremely painful and extremely hard. It made me examine myself on levels that I had never examined myself before. It made me change things about myself for the better. And it's difficult. I remember early on, second year after the divorce, and I'm going back to the court again and again and again because he keeps dragging me back into court. And I'm talking to a counselor, and this is shortly after my lawyer had been like, "Well, don't you realize he's not in control anymore?" And then my counselor's like, "Well, don't you realize he's not in control anymore?" And I had to explain to them, he's in control of my children, so he's in control of me. As long as somebody is in control of the things that matter the most in your world, they're in control of you, right? And so he lost control when my children stopped talking to me. He could no longer control me when my children stopped talking to me. Now, was that painful? Fuck yes. It was horrific. I've got videos on here of me literally bawling my eyes out of my car because I wasn't sure whether my children were safe, right? Awesome, Star. Um, and yet he lost control and he'll never have control again, right? So the best thing to do to deal with a narcissist is, if possible, get them out of your life. Now, that's not always possible. And if that's not possible, gray rock. And you can do some research on gray rock, but basically it's one wording the conversation. One word answers, not getting involved. Alienation and what they call emotional incest. It's not like he's screwing them, but like you gang up on somebody, right? Like mom's the problem, so we have to join together against mom, right? And people can convince a child that positive things are negative, right? Especially when a child wants that parent to love them. And when you look at a narcissistic parent, they withhold love. Love becomes one of those things that you get only if you behave in a certain way, right? So if love is something that you only get when you behave in a certain way, you behave in that certain way so that you can have that love, right? Um, I have one child who was always my child because their father didn't want them and treated them like they didn't want them. And when that changed, when their father finally realized that if I don't start making some changes, then I'm going to lose both of my children because the courts are going to take them away, right? Because my child who he was treating badly was starting to show that he was being treated badly, and fucking CPS was getting involved and his counselors were getting involved, and so my ex had to change his behavioral patterns and start acting like he loved that child, right? Or treating that child with the loving behavior he should have always treated that child with, right? And so Then he convinced like I had gotten a lawyer for my youngest child because my youngest child needed different things than my oldest child. And how I got a lawyer for my youngest child was my youngest child was displaying gender fluidity. They were displaying evidence of being gender fluid or being LGBTQ. And so I told my lawyer and I told the judge, I said, my child is LGBTQ and my ex is homophobic. So he needs a lawyer that can deal with this. Now, that got him a lawyer. Then it got him a counselor he could trust because at the time he didn't have a counselor he could trust. And he literally was like, I can't trust my counselor. Every time I say something to my counselor, she tells my dad. So it got him a lawyer he could trust and a counselor he could trust. Yet, when that counselor helped him and that lawyer helped him, and it faced that my ex might lose him because of what he was doing, my ex had to change his behavior to him. And in changing his behavior to him, he had to also make the lawyer and the counselor a bad thing. And so he convinced my youngest son that I had outed him to society. And because I had outed him, there was something wrong with me. So then my child comes to me and gets mad at me because I told my lawyer that my child was probably LGBTQ. And I did. I said, I don't know what's going on, but he seems like he's gender fluid and LGBTQ. And I think he needs somebody that's going to be able to help him get through this, right? So my ex convinced my child that I did something wrong by advocating for my child, right? So narcissists have that ability, right? Especially if somebody wants the love that they're finally giving them. If a narcissist has been withholding love from somebody and they're finally giving that love, then they can really convince that child that the sun is down and the moon is yellow, right? Like they can convince that child of anything, right? I'm not sure if who I am as a mother is shining through yet. I can't wait for them to be out from underneath his thumb. I'm sure it will then. They're still pretty caught up in him, but at least they're back in my world. And I just, I just take the silver lining. I just take the silver lining. And really, they came back because we divorced in 2015 and he got married again in 2018. And then he got divorced in 2021. And then he got married again in 2021. He divorced in May and then got married again in December. And he's now divorced again. No, 2022. 2022. He divorced in 2022 in May and got married again in 2022 in December, which is when my older child came back to me. My older son came back to me and went, and it was really because of the fact that he kept telling them that I was the whore who was out screwing everybody. And I'm not. I've been with the same person for a few years and I wasn't introducing them to a lot of people and I haven't been married again. And so he was telling them that it was me that was doing these things. Yet it's his fourth divorce. And yet when he started showing that it was really him doing those things, my kids went, oh, you said you weren't going to get married again, Dad. How the fuck are you getting married again and again and again, right? And so I don't think they've really quite seen fully yet, but they're starting to, right? They're seeing the pattern. They're seeing the behavioral, right? They always project. Told everybody how I cheated on him. I've always been a polyamorous person, but he wanted to be monogamous. So we were monogamous, but he cheated the whole fucking time. Told everybody how I was cheating, but he had like 3 different affairs. And he, to this day, tells everybody that I was a cheating whore. But he was the one that was having affairs, right? So, it's all that projection. And when they start to see that projection, right? I do think, though, that really it will take them being out from underneath him. It took my oldest being out from underneath him to actually see too I did make mistakes and I would never try and make it seem like I didn't make mistakes in parenting. I did make mistakes in parenting, right? That the mistakes that I made in parenting, I was at least accountable for and trying to change. And when they're able to see that is when it really starts to shift, I believe. But really to me, that's the only way you can get rid of the narcissist. And is it traumatic and hard? It is. Absolutely 100%. Are you better off for it? Absolutely 100%. I hear you whining. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go. My dog is whining at me to go outside. I want to remind you all before I go that we are all nurturing and communal. And when you're dealing with depression, In a sick society, it is because you're healthy and the society around you is sick. And when we are nurturing and communal, and the society tells us that we're not allowed to be, and nobody nurtures us, and nobody is communal, it becomes extremely painful for us. And so when you're dealing with depression and anxiety, you're dealing with those things because you're healthy in a sick society. And this is an indicator that you still have that beautiful compassion and empathy within you. It is those of us who are dealing with that depression, who can see that, who are anxious, that are needed and necessary for change. We are all worthy, every single one of us. It does not matter if you're exploitable to the higher ups, i.e., you can work a good job for them. It doesn't matter if you're exploitable. You are worthy just by breathing. You're worthy just by breathing. And you are necessary if you can see the trauma of society so that you can change it. And it is only those of us who can feel and see the trauma of society that can change it. And therefore, we are more necessary. So give yourself grace. There's nothing wrong with you. You are actually not the problem. You are the solution. You are actually not the one that is the trauma. You are the one that is able to help us fix it. Give yourself grace. Give yourself love. You are necessary and you are needed. And you are worthy just by existing. Just your existence makes you worthy. Okay? I love you so very much. There's an entire world out here who not only loves you, but needs you. Take care of yourself and give yourself grace today, because it is through giving ourselves grace and through seeing what needs to be changed that we can change things for the better, so that we can make society into what it was, a space where we can all grow, a space where we are all taking care of each other, a space where we are healthy and society around us is healthy. I love you all very much. You take care, and I'll be back in a couple of days, I'm sure. And we'll be talking more about some of these different things. Maybe we'll talk about these old finds here in Turtle Island that we were talking about. We'll talk about a few different things, but take care of yourself. Take care of yourself, because you are necessary and you are needed. This world can't do better without you in it. Love you very much. Have a great one, everybody. Bye, YouTube. I love you very much. Take so much care of yourself.